What did Oprah Winfrey get her? What did Taylor Swift get her? Hollywood came out in force, and the American people either yawned or gave them the finger. So when I think about the diminishment of celebrity, and when I imagine or believe, as I do, that every action does have an equal and opposite reaction, well, wouldn't that also mean the ascendancy of the common man in some way? That's what's going on in our country. The thing we've been focused on has been revealed to be less important than we thought. And the things we've ignored, we're beginning to realize may be far more important than we ever imagined. Trade schools might somehow be right at the center of this whole sticky wicket. And I think in the coming years, we're going to see a recalibration of all of it.
I see him. How are you?
Well, I'd say busy, but the word has lost all meaning and relevance. So, fine.
Well, it's good to hear that you're doing fine.
How about you?
Oh man, well I was gonna say busy as well, but now I feel like I have to switch a little tax here. But yeah, it's fortunate. How about that? I feel extremely fortunate.
Do you feel like you got your hands around this thing yet? Or do you feel like everything is either a version of preparing for the next thing that happens in 2 hours or 2 weeks or whatever the deadline is, whether it's a book or a podcast or whatever it is? Are you a fireman now, or are you like a proactive planning media assassin?
I aspire for the second, for the latter. So I'd say work in progress, and but those deadlines, some of them come and go, like the long-term writing ones, and you get a little bit of leeway there in publishing if you're actually making the publishing house money, because very few people actually do that. So you get a little bit of leeway there. But I'd like to get to a point where those deadlines aren't zinging right by. But that just happens to be life right now. And writing those scripts for the shows, editing a show that's coming out here this summer, writing now on each one, not just giving notes on those things, writing the book, doing the nonfiction, podcast, social posts, family. That's a big one, especially around the holidays here.
Well, I noticed that's number 8 now.
I'm going to have to go back and edit that and move that to the top in case my wife listens to this. But it's crazy. Man. It's all great, though.
Well, do they help you or hurt you, deadlines? Well, like, where would you be without them? Would you get anything done at all? Or
it would probably push things closer to what you think of as great rather than as good as you can get it on this timeline, if that makes sense. So there's that piece of it. So they're helpful in that you need to get to one to start the next project. And that's the aspiration. It seems like as I'm in the middle of a book, I'm already looking forward to the next one, but I have to finish this one, and all that bandwidth has to go into this one. But at the same time, I know that there's another one that I want to catch up on so that I'm not as far behind for this for the next year. But it's all great though. Yeah.
I had a boss once in San Francisco. In fact, I wrote about him briefly because he said something that, man, it just stuck with me in a way that I didn't think it would when he said it. But I was hosting a daily show, right? So every evening, an episode of Evening Magazine would air. It came on after the local news.
Oh, I remember.
And so every morning we'd shoot raps and I'd, rush back to the studio and then rush through the edit and we'd get it on the air. It was like that scene in broadcast news, where like, she's sliding down the hallway with the tape in her hand and it gets in the machine and we just make it. And, after doing this for a couple of years, I started working on stories that I really cared about. And I just never felt like I had the time to make them as good as they could be. And I called him one day and I said, Orkin, is it good? Is it ready? And he said, it's better than ready. It's better than good. It's done. And then it airs.
Hey, that's awesome. I love that. I'm going to remember that. There's a few things that I wrote down from your book that are going to stay with me, but I love that. Introducing the new Jack Carr BCM Mod 4 grip. Reduced angle for improved ergonomics and trigger control. New aggressive grip texture to maximize traction. Extended forward tang to close the gap between the trigger guard and pistol grip. High-rise beaver tail style backstrap. Open bottom to minimize weight. Includes mounting hardware for mil-spec lower receivers. Manufactured in the USA from high-quality impact-resistant polymers. Go to BravoCompanyUSA.com and get yours today. And I remember Evening Magazine, Jan Yanahiro and Richard Hart.
So I replaced Richard Hart, not directly, but Jan and Richard did their thing for years.
Yeah.
And then it went away, and then they rebooted it with Malou Nubla and Jonathan Hart. Okay. And then something happened, and Jonathan was out of the sketch, and I didn't really want a job, but I got shanghaied into it. And next thing you know, I'm in San Francisco impersonating a show host.
Well, that seems to happen to you a couple times over the last few decades. And it's a fascinating story. I love your story, attitude, outlook, all the inspiration you provide people just by being who you are. It's really incredible to watch. And I don't know if you reckon, I wore this sweatshirt today because I think you wore something like this on Dirty Jobs at some point. American Giant. I think you wore some American Giant stuff at some point.
I still have.
The
that
original
sweatshirt is 15 years old. Nice. Bayard Winthrop,
yeah,
the CEO, sent. I didn't know who this guy was, and believe me, when I got his note, I'm like, Bayard Winthrop. I mean, it sounds like he fell off the Mayflower.
Yeah.
In fact, I think he did. I think he's like goes all the way back, but he was a Wall Street guy who just got religion and decided, you know what, I'm going to make clothes in this country, come hell or high water. In fact, he made this shirt. This is a single yarn dyed flannel that he went on this mission. He's like, I'm going to make a flannel shirt the way they used to make them when I was a kid, and I don't care if it kills me. I'm going to get it done. And he did.
I knew he was doing that. Didn't there a book about it, American Flannel or something like that? Didn't there something?
I got it lying around here somewhere. Yeah, you would like the guy who wrote it. It's not just a rumination on flannel, but it's just a look at making shit here, and what it takes, and in particular through the textile industry. Yeah. And the challenges, Jack. Oh my God. It's like the universe said, you want to make socks? I dare you. Try it. Just try it. You want to make that shirt? I dare you. These people who are doing it, man, I just give them huge credit because they are Sisyphus. They're stoics. They're pushing a rock up a hill.
Yep, and there's a few out there that are doing it and telling that story as part of their brand, and using those platforms available today to do that, which is fantastic. I wanted to ask you if was Evening Magazine your introduction to the area of California that you continue to gravitate towards today?
I won't say I gravitate towards it. It's more like a tractor beam sucked me back.
Yeah.
I had no great bucket list or wish fulfillment to live in the Bay Area. In fact, in 1999, I was in Marina del Rey, down in the southern part. I didn't really own anything. I'd been freelancing for 10 years. I lived in hotels. I had clothing deals, like these individual little shows that I worked on. It was a crazy situation, but it was like I could walk into an Eddie Bauer or an American Eagle in any town, pick up the clothes I needed for some shoot, go to the shoot, do the shoot, go to the airport, give the clothes that I wasn't wearing to whatever homeless dude was roughly my size, and then go to the next town and do the next project. It was a very weird weird way to live, but I loved it back in those days. And so it was a very minimalist approach. I didn't care where I lived. I just happened to be in Southern California when 9/11 happened. And for the first time in my life, I don't know what it was, but just this nagging desire to um, have some kind of attachment to something, some sort of job, maybe a 1099. It was maybe a W-2 instead of a 1099, you know. So anyway, I moved up to San Francisco uh, later in September of that year,
Oh,
2001, and started impersonating a show host on Evening Magazine. And had I not done that, certainly Dirty Jobs never would have happened. You know, I mean, it's easy to look back and go, oh, well, that was the pivotal thing. And I'm probably guilty of doing that a lot. You know, it's kind of indulgent to look back and go, holy crap, you know, sliding doors, right? This instead of that, and you wind up here instead of there. But coming up to San Francisco to play around on local TV, that opened a door into a whole world that I really didn't think I was even interested in.
yeah. Then you have, well, the next 20 years, which probably equates to you being able to live wherever you want at this point, I would venture. But you decided to stay there. So what keeps you there?
Um, Again, full disclosure, it's not like there's a plaque out front of my yard that says, be it ever so humble. There's no place like this. I don't really care.
Mm.
I just got so incredibly busy when Dirty Jobs hit that I never stopped. And that show stayed in production for 12 years. Others spun out of it around the same time that I was involved in. I started a foundation that has turned into the pointy part of the stick
Mm.
with regard to reinvigorating the trades. I made deals with half a dozen Fortune 500 companies who supported that foundation, but also hired me to sell their trucks and their heavy equipment and their things, you know. And
Uh,
so I just suddenly found myself in the middle of this weird swirling vortex, you know, half of which was dedicated to the missionary position vis-a-vis the foundation, and the other half was the mercenary position. And I never had an agent or a manager or any of that, but I had a good lawyer who became my business partner, Mary Sullivan, and between us, we kind of carved out our weird little slice of this Sodom and Gomorrah entertainment world. And most of the work took place in the middle, honestly. Coming back to the Bay Area, coming back to the home I'm in now, which is a little north of San Francisco. I'm literally staring at the Golden Gate Bridge. It's pretty, it's nice, and I come back here 8, 10 days a month to recharge and just catch my breath when I can.
yeah, not a bad spot. And
No.
you didn't find your niche. You created a niche, and I always love that when people do something different. Like let's say a Sitka Gear, who all of a sudden we have like Cabela's type hunting equipment for years and years and years, kind of boxy, kind of thick, and it's fine. But then you have someone that takes the Arc'teryx and the Patagonia and maybe at the time North Face and then creates hunting apparel that's technical around that. And now you have all of these, so they create a new category, and you have all of these other companies in competition for them now, but it wouldn't happen without them or without Yeti coolers. There's all sorts. I love when people or companies do things like that create this new direction, and so much respect for that. And you did that in, for lack of a better term, in the entertainment space.
Well, thanks. You know, I've become a little suspicious of taking too much credit for that. I mean, revisionist history is a thing, and it's so beguiling and it's so tempting to look back and either tell yourself the story you want to hear, and then of course tell the world how you did it. And you know, I'll take it to a point, but for me, it was much more of a Forrest Gumpian kind of uh, fits and starts and kind of floundering around,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and suddenly realizing in a sewer of all places that after 15 years of freelancing as a host, maybe I was a better guest the whole time, And when you start to see yourself as a guest instead of a host, well, it changes the way you approach the business of making TV. And if you take the word reality literally and say, well, if I'm going to be in reality TV, whatever that meant in 2002, 2003, then I want it to be real. And so I'll take some credit for insisting that a behind the scenes camera document the making of dirty jobs, but I can't take too much credit or too much blame, frankly, for the fact that that show spawned 35 other shows that really I didn't have much to do with, other than saying, "Hey, look, what if what if the expert on the screen wasn't the host? What if it wasn't the narrator? What if it was this sewer inspector, or this bridge builder, or this skull cleaner, or this person who has no experience in TV but great knowledge in their field? And what if the host shows up with a measure of humility you might normally not associate with hosts, and say, look, man, when I said hello, I told you all I knew. Okay, I don't know your job, but as an apprentice or a cipher or an avatar, uh, I'd like to learn, and my crew will stay out of the way. We'll just document it, and then we'll put it on the air. Well, I honestly didn't think it would work, Jack. And I certainly didn't think I'd get 10,000 letters from people saying, hey, you think that was dirty? You should meet my brother, my cousin, my sister. Wait do you see what they do, right? I didn't know that was going to happen. So for me, the best things that have happened when I look back are those things that felt kind of scary to do, but also kind of why not? It's part reverse commute, and then it's just part straight up serendipity when the headlines catch up to you and make your thing relevant in ways that you never thought it would be. That's that's when you're fortunate for real. And it is part having the stones to maybe zig when everybody else is zagging. But man, there's plenty of luck in it too. No
Oh,
getting around it.
don't discount that, and you'll take it. Rather be lucky than good type of a thing. But I got to ask you. I saw approaching that as a student. I think played a big role in it. That's how I approach things in the military. How I approach things now. I have approached life as approach everything as a student. I always want to learn, and it seems to have worked up to this point anyway. But I have to ask about the watch on this. Are you a watch guy? We haven't talked about that before.
The watch I'm wearing?
Yeah,
on
very
the cover
prominent.
of that book? You know what that was? That was a total accident. I'm
Really?
looking at it right now. That was a gift from a guy who started a company not unlike Bayard's,
Oh,
American Giant. It's a company called Shinola.
okay. Yeah, yeah.
And I forget his name, but he really bet on the business of made in the USA in Detroit at a
Okay.
time when Detroit was
Yeah.
back on its heels in a big way. And I ran into this guy in Mackinac, Michigan, and he came up to me in the airport and he took off the watch he was wearing and he put it in my hand. And he said, "You don't know me." I think his first name was Gary, but he said, "I want you to have this, and I'd be honored if you just took a look at what we're doing." They were making bicycles, they were making watches, they were making these cool, weird, random products that you just didn't seem to have a whole lot to do with one another. But that was probably 12 years ago, 10, 12 years ago. Thing keeps on ticking. It's a great watch.
Nice. I love it. I love it. When did you learn that your voice was going to play a part in your journey? Were you aware that what point did you think, oh, I have this voice that is distinctive. It gives an air of competence and competence, whether or not I actually have those things. Did you become aware of that, or is it just something that is and you don't think about?
Well, it was certainly not baked in. My voice changed when I was young, but also when I was young, I had a stammer. And so I never really thought in terms of, wow, I'm going to use my voice. In fact, I was pretty shy about the whole thing, especially if I got excited or worked up. It wasn't like a full-on Porky Pig, that's all folks kind of thing, but it was
Mhm.
just this weird nervous hitch, and and I suspected I would have it all of my life, but I got very lucky, fortunate, as you would say, with a high school music teacher, a guy named Fred King. And of course, you can't stutter when you sing. And so I was always gravitating toward choirs and these a cappella groups and things. Um, but he was also he was such a man's man. This guy, he was a former Navy guy, Golden Gloves boxer. He's a football player in college, in the Navy, got most of his teeth knocked out and decided to have them all pulled. He was only like 22. So he was always wearing these dentures, and he never used like polygrip or anything. So he was always taking his teeth out to screw around with the students. It was the craziest thing. He was a very funny, unusual guy. And then he had his dentist make these joke teeth, these horrible looking teeth, and he would wear them as if they were really his. All he just the guy was so unusual in so many ways, and I loved him. He was just so passionate about music, and he kind of became a mentor of sorts. Anyway, he made me audition for a play, Jack. He said, "Look, I think you'd be good on stage." And I'm like, "I'm not getting on stage. I can barely string two sentences together." And he said, "No, no, you'll be fine." And I I trusted him enough to audition. I memorized a monologue, and I went out, and I got about 20 seconds into it, and I'm doing my usual hitching and stammering, and he stops me. He just holds up his hand. There are other people in the audience, who are out there watching. They were casting for a musical called South Pacific.
Mhm.
And he said, "Mike, I love what you're doing with this character here, but the character you're reading for doesn't stutter. Do that on your own time. Just give me the words here." And I know how glib that sounds, but I trusted him so much I didn't even think twice about it. I just jumped right back into it, started talking, and about 20, 25 seconds into it, there was no stammer. And he just kind of looked at me and gives me a shrug as if to say, "Hey, why don't you act like a guy who doesn't stammer for a while and see how that works out?"
Wow.
And and that was kind of, I think, the first time I thought, you know, maybe I could get paid to talk. And I put together a narration tape shortly after that, right after I graduated from high school. And I sent it to an agent, and the agent sent it out, and I wound up getting hired over the phone to narrate a special on the National Geographic.
Whoa.
High above the vast reaches of the barren Serengeti, the lone wildebeest walks away from the herd to refresh himself at a watering hole. Next thing you know, he's getting torn apart by alligators and hyenas. And I'm the guy telling you about it. And I was probably 19.
No
And
way.
the director thought I was like 40. So I started narrating things when I was young.
No
Uh,
way. Was that the
yeah.
National Geographic one that went in IMAX when all those were coming out back then?
No, this would have been before that.
I mean, early 90s, I want to say. I want to say about
Be,
93, 94. There was one, maybe it
no,
was called Serengeti.
this is more like 84.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
this was, I mean, the Discovery Channel had just gone on the air. PBS was doing some documentaries. And so through the 80s, I kind of schnurred my way around the edges of narrating some of these docs. Um, and then, things circle back. 15 years later, I wound up narrating most of them, I think.
Wow. That's amazing.
It's crazy how it works out.
And so in between those two, is this when you're listening to your Walkman, walking around the streets, teaching
Oh,
yourself
God.
how to sing opera?
Well, look, the real story is I was a shy, stammery kid with a low voice who wanted desperately to follow in his grandfather's footsteps. My granddad lived next door to our little farmhouse north of Baltimore, and he only went to the seventh grade. But he was a savant. He could take that watch apart that I'm wearing on the cover of that book and put it back together blindfolded. He could build a house without a blueprint. He was just mechanically inclined, and I was certain that I would follow in his footsteps. I worked as his apprentice every summer on all kinds of different projects, and learned slowly. The first great disappointment of life for me was realizing just because you love something doesn't mean you can't suck at it. And the handy gene in this case turned out to be recessive. I didn't get it easily. It didn't come naturally. And one afternoon, I just screwed up a foundation pour, got the concrete mix wrong, and my pop, Carl Noble was his name, just pulled me aside and said, "Hey, man, you can be a tradesman if you want. Just get a different toolbox." And so that was the moment I realized I wasn't going to be able to do what I wanted to do. And it took a couple years, but then Fred King was the teacher who came along and said, "Hey, you might be good at something you don't want to do. And if that's the case, well, then maybe you should either just suck it up and do it anyway, or figure out a way how to love it,
Yeah.
you know?" And so the business of getting a different toolbox started when my pop told me that I was never going to be able to do what he did, and got to the next level when my high school music teacher said, "Look, you've got to be curious, man. You've got to suck up everything. Don't listen to this thing that says, 'Oh, this is my dream,' or 'Oh, this is what I've always wanted to do. Try it. Might work out. But just remember, you have the ability to learn how to love anything." And so I had no real interest in singing or narrating or hosting shows or writing. I had no real interest in philosophy or English. Um, uh, Certainly in opera, to get to your question, none of this was inherently interesting to me. But as I started to get the toolbox together, I started to realize, I started to meet people who did those things who I liked. And then I started to ask myself, well, why do I like them? Like what is it about it? And in part it was they did have a passion for what they were doing, but I got super excited early on by this idea that you could choose to be passionate about anything.
Yeah.
And so that is what led me to audition for the Baltimore Opera, because I had no interest in singing in the opera, but I learned from one of my friends that if you get your union card for the opera, it's called AGMA, the American Guild of Musical Artists. If you can get into the opera and get that card, you can buy your union card into any sister union, like the Screen Actors Guild, which I very much wanted to be in, or the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, AFTRA, which I also wanted to be in. But I grew up in Baltimore, and the town and the unions were kind of closed in those towns. So I couldn't get an agent if I wasn't in the union. And if I wasn't in the union, I couldn't audition for union work. And without an agent, I had no hope of doing that anyhow. So I had to get in the union. And I couldn't do it without an agent, but I couldn't get an agent without the work. So I memorized the shortest aria I could find from Puccini's La Boheme, and with a little help from a friend that I used to sing with in high school, I auditioned for the Baltimore Opera on a Thursday afternoon back in 1983 or four, I guess. And you know, my plan did not go as planned. I got in, but rather than leave after one or two shows, I found myself weirdly loving the music, and I was a 23-year-old kid dressed as a pirate, surrounded by women in the chorus, which was I mean, just as a sidebar, the rep company had 80 people. 45 of them were women, 35 were guys. Out of the 35 guys, 30 of them had zero interest in 100% of the women. So the remaining 5 straight dudes, 3 of them were married.
Your odds are
And
looking
the
better
only
and
other
better.
single straight guy, had a mole on his eyelid the size of your thumb with thick black hair and whatever. So
things are looking good for you.
I stayed for 8 years.
Yeah. That's a long run, especially for someone with no interest in opera.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Hi, this is Jack Carr, and I wanted to talk about some of the weapons used in the pages of my terminal list series. And wanted to start with why it was important for me to include SIG P226, also in its variant known as the Mark 25, in my first novel, Terminal List. And that is because I used this particular pistol right here on every deployment. So this is the 226 right here, Mark 25 variant, and it just fits my hand like a glove, like it was just built for it. I always carried this pistol on me. If I had to put down my long gun to go into a meeting or go somewhere where I wasn't supposed to be armed downrange in Iraq or Afghanistan or a couple other places around the world, then I always had SIG in a holster, concealed right there. And right here you can see there's a commemorative pistol that SIG has out this year for the 40th anniversary of the SIG P226. And this one right here is a number of edition that we did for the terminal list. You can see right there on the top, it says the terminal list. It's just an important pistol to me, so it made sense to include in the novel, and it blows the conspiracy wide open. It's just one of those things that if you're not a gun guy, you just wouldn't understand. And in the TV show, you can see Chris Pratt and Taylor Kitsch starring as James Reese and Ben Edwards talking about this on the boat in episode 1, where the SIG P226 plays a major role.
I don't buy it, man. No way Boozer offs himself with this SIG. No way.
Something you had to know about Boozer to understand. He would never have shot himself with a 9mm. An outsider, trying to make it look like a SEAL suicide, would find it convenient to use the same type of handgun that SEALs were issued. What they couldn't know was that Boozer was a real gun guy who'd grown up shooting competitively before he'd ever even thought about joining the Navy to become a frogman. Boozer had a love affair with custom 1911s chambered in .45 ACP, which most people just would not understand. Boozer hated the 9mm, and even though he had a SIG P226 in his collection to commemorate the pistol all SEALs had carried into combat since 9/11, his disdain for the smaller round was part of his identity. And that right there blows the conspiracy wide open in the terminal list.
It's crazy when I think back at it. In those days, I was singing in the opera at night. I was negotiating computer contracts for service agreements for a company called Computerland during the day. And in between, I was auditioning for commercials and getting booked to narrate documentaries. And I mean, super weird, dude, when you think of like how many people are singing in the opera, negotiating service contracts, and telling you stories about wildebeest who shouldn't leave the herd. It was a weird way to assemble a toolbox.
Yeah.
But there were plenty of lessons to be learned from the opera. So many. And that's kind of where my actual education, I think, started.
Have you talked to anybody else who had a similar path on the opera side, meaning they knew really nothing about opera and just memorized a song, an aria from an opera, and then got up there not knowing really what it meant and spent all this time in the opera, fell in love with it? Have you talked to anyone that has that sort of a story?
No, no, I haven't.
That's so great.
I mean, look, I think for me, what I said earlier, impersonating a host. I'm not trying to be really self-deprecating, but the truth is, it's kind of what I've always done. I've always hovered around things like a moth to a flame.
Yes.
I've always lingered under the net right? Knowing that, yeah, the ball's probably going to get to me at some point. But I'm rarely all in. You know, I was certainly not all in with the opera. In fact, I they kind of tolerated me. You know, I was amusing and they kept me around. And then a couple of the guys who really knew what they were doing, they took me under their wing, and I wound up taking some actual lessons, and I improved dramatically, and I picked up some Italian, and I learned.
Yeah.
I learned after the fact. You know, it'd be like kind of getting in the SEALs without going through buds, right?
People just like you having you around. You're a good guy. You tell some good stories. You seem fairly
Yes.
competent every now and again, and that's
Yep.
People want to be around you.
you could I learned that I could create the illusion of competence in in
So
short
great.
bursts
That's so great.
around a lot of different things.
Yeah.
You know, it was really like the old song says, you know, I know a little bit about a lot of things. And so that was sort of the beginning of this curiosity fueled romp through the entertainment industry where, you know, I mean, looking back, it's like, well, wait a minute, dude, you faked your way into the opera. Why wouldn't you fake your way into the home shopping industry? Why wouldn't you fake your way into the Discovery Channel?
Yeah.
Why not? You know, I mean, as long as you're being honest about your shortcomings, then you're not a threat to anybody. And if you're genuinely curious about this thing called nonfiction, which of course is rooted in curiosity, then maybe you'll get some extra credit for that too. So, you know, looking back now, it's really two chunks. There's 15 years after the opera where I had maybe 300 jobs in the entertainment industry, one weirder than the next. And then when I was 42, I began to think really differently about work. I was at Evening Magazine. My mother did call me to tell me my granddad had just turned 90. And I was sitting in my cubicle listening to my mother when she said to me, Michael, wouldn't it be great if before he died, he could turn on the TV and see you doing something that looked like work? That was every bit as important as my pop telling me to get a different toolbox 20 years earlier. And that's what drove me into the sewers of San Francisco with my cameraman from Evening Magazine. And that's when I learned that I was a pretty good host, but a much better guest. And if we just simply used the footage that happened naturally and put it out there and just sort of told the truth, something good might happen.
Wow.
And yeah,
Man.
I mean, it's just bananas when you think about the way that way leads on to way.
I love it. I love it. And I was with, so we're in this is the first podcast of 2025. So I'm going to get your thoughts on the State of the Union. We're recording it in December, mid-December-ish right now. Just got back from the Army-Navy game over the weekend. Took my youngest out there, who's 14. So he's meeting Medal of Honor recipients, former directors of the CIA. I was so proud to see him interacting with these adults at 14, shaking hands, looking them in the eye, and then to see the Corps cadets and see the midshipmen out there and experience that, something I always wanted to experience when I was a little kid. But while we were out there, we were hanging out with a Special Forces buddy of mine who became a Border Patrol agent, but only became a Border Patrol agent because he kept his friend awake when they were police officers after getting out of Army Special Forces, and is driving him a few hours up because they were night shift and they had in the morning go interview for a job for the Border Patrol or take a test or something along those lines, like an ASVAB type test or the Border Patrol's equivalent of that. And so he's just there to keep his buddy awake and keep him company and go to the Border Patrol. And so they go up there. His buddy goes in to do that, and he's sitting there in the lobby reading a book, and reading a Ludlum book, he told me. And one of the supervisors comes out and says, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I'm just keeping my buddy awake on the ride up." And the guy says, "Well, do you want to be in the Border Patrol?" And he's like, I don't know. I was like, "Wait, well, get in here and take the test." And so he goes in and then has a career with the Border Patrol. And very similar to the QVC story with you and the bartender. I mean, imagine if you hadn't walked into that bar that night or sat somewhere else or not had a certain conversation. And it's amazing how that happens.
Well, look, this is the great challenge of telling a story isn't in knowing how to end it. It's knowing where to begin it. And, it doesn't matter how many times I learned this lesson. Like right now, I could have easily told you that everything I ever really needed to know, I learned in the middle of the night on the QVC cable shopping channel, where I spent 3 years in a kind of nocturnal purgatory. But I never would have got there if I hadn't messed up the foundation pour. And if my pop hadn't told me to get a better toolbox, and if Fred King hadn't told me to act like a guy who didn't stammer, and if what's his name over at the National Geographic, hadn't asked me or had asked me how old I was. Like all these different things matter. And what you're talking about, oh my God, that day, I'd been with the opera for 7 years. I was 29. No, I was 27. I didn't have any money. I liked my life. I had some. I was doing okay, but I just kind of knew that something had to give. I needed some sort of job. I walked over to the Mount Royal Tavern in Baltimore during the intermission of a production of Wagner, I think it was, Der Ring des Nibelungen, interminable Teutonic dirge. I was just in the chorus. I didn't have to be on stage for like an hour. And with the intermission break, that was plenty of time to watch the back half of the football game, which I planned to do at the bar, dressed as a Viking, drinking a beer.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I walked into that bar, and the bartender was watching a big guy in a shiny suit sell pots and pans. And I said, Rick, why aren't we watching the game? And he said, I'm auditioning for that guy's job tomorrow. QVC was doing a national talent search. And so I sat there drinking a beer, dressed as a Viking, thinking to myself, well, hell, I think I could do that. Like, does that guy get paid? And Rick is like, yeah, he gets paid like $100,000 a year plus a bonus. This is in 1989. Now the guy dressed as a Viking is really paying attention. So I finished my beer and went back and sang the rest of the opera. And then I went down and auditioned the next morning for QVC. And again, I just don't understand how you could script anything like this, but it happened. I talked about a pencil for 8 minutes, Jack, in a conference room on camera, not knowing that anybody who can talk about a pencil for 8 minutes winds up getting hired on a probationary period for 3 months. There's no training program. They literally put you on the air in the middle of the night and bring you product after product after product, things that didn't sell in prime time typically. So they were just, they had nothing to lose, and this is how they figure out if you can fill time for 8 minutes at a time. So you get the Amcor negative ion generator, you get the health team infrared pain reliever, eel skin wallets for him and plus-sized fashions for her, and Capita Monte and Yardro and Hummels and collectible dolls. And it's like all the stuff that was in some giant machine on a midway of a condemned carnival, with a giant claw comes down and picks something out, and then you have to talk about it.
Oh man,
that was a training program. That was my buds.
Wow.
That was, you do that for a while, and you'll figure out right quick who your audience is and and who you are.
And poor Rick has to be at that bar, serving drinks, cleaning things, looking up at that screen, seeing you on there, just shaking his head. Exactly. Yeah. Poor Rick. I wonder if you'll ever meet back up with him now that you've told that, story and it's out there.
I'll probably hear from him after this. For sure. I've talked to him in a few years, but he's still out there.
All right. And so State of the Union, since we're going into January 2025 when this drops, what are your thoughts on the State of the Union after the last few years and everything we've been through as a country over the last essentially decade, and these changes with whether they're environmental, political, AI? People ask you about that all the time, I'm sure, because of mikeroweWORKS and everything that you're doing. Are you hopeful? I guess that's a better way to put it. Are you hopeful for the future, and what do you think of the trajectory that we are on as a nation?
Yeah, obviously it's a big question, and at the risk of sounding a little schizophrenic, I I would reserve my comments to say that I reserve the right to change my mind not only next week or tomorrow, but maybe in the middle of the sentence I've
Yes.
not yet completed.
Understood.
It's fast, you know. In general, I am very hopeful. In general, I still don't think there's ever been a better time in the history of the species to be alive than right now. I say that knowing full well that I got pretty good cards and I'm living the life that I want to be living. But beyond that, there's never been a better time to get sick. There's never been a better time to want to travel. We're living in a great time and we're living in an interesting time. And if you want to dive in to all the trouble in the world, if you want to get a good close look at all the drama of our union, oh my God, we've never been more connected, for better or worse, than we are right now. You mentioned the Army-Navy game. The image that struck me, there's Trump, there's J.D. Vance, there's Mike Johnson up in the booth, and there's Elon Musk right behind him. It was a quick meme that made the rounds after that game. And I just thought, man, what an extraordinary quartet all of a sudden, you know. So I I think it's just really too much for most people to think about too broadly, but I'm relieved that we are where we are right now personally. I don't have a crystal ball, and I certainly understand there's a lot of fear and loathing and gnashing of teeth. This drone thing is a great metaphor. Now, I realize who knows what the headlines will be when your audience is listening to this, but right now, on December 16th or whatever it is, we don't know. We I mean, we've got smart people saying they're all airplanes. We have other smart people saying, no, maybe a few, but most of them are not. And they're not just drones, they're the size of an SUV. We've got other smart people saying it looks like they're actually, believe it or not, trying to smell things. There's technology now in drones, and they're out there searching for odors. Why are their lights on if they don't want to be seen? Why do they turn their lights off when we approach them? Is it from an Iranian ship off the coast? Seemed like it could be. Then it seemed like maybe not. I think when you look at like that one little headline right now, it's so endemic of the confusion and the possibilities and the certainty, right? I mean, everybody's so certain, Jack. Everybody's so sure. Everybody's so righteous. Everybody's so angry. Everybody's so impatient. We need answers right now. Why is it that we need answers right now regarding the drones when we've been living with the ambiguity surrounding UFOs and UAPs for so long? Like, why all of a sudden do we need to know? I'm not saying we shouldn't. I want to know too. But I just think we're living in some weird triangulated singularity of curiosity, access, technology, frustration. It's all got people just in a ball of ambiguity. And I guess the reason I'm afraid of sounding schizophrenic is because I, on the one hand, don't really want to be a part of all of that anxiety. On the other hand, God help me, sure is fun to watch.
Yeah, it's a little crazy right now. You know, you posted this, gosh, was it a year ago? You walked into the airport and took a picture of whatever 24-hour news station was on, and it was Robert Kennedy's top VP picks, and there was maybe 8 or 10 even up there, and there you were. So you were almost up there in that box.
Yeah, man. This is weird, and I didn't think I was ever going to talk about it because I run this foundation that purports to be apolitical, and we are. But it's difficult to not be in a world where everything's politicized. My foundation awards work ethic scholarships. I talk a lot about education and I talk a lot about workforce, and those two things are obviously political. And so I I'm always kind of dancing around the business of endorsements and the business of, you know, letting too much of my personal slip show. I try not to do that. So when Bobby Kennedy called and asked if I wanted to be his vice president, my first instinct was just to look over my shoulder and see if there was a camera there, because this is something my friends would do just to yank my chain. He can't be serious. But he was serious, and he said something that actually really got my attention. On the phone, he said, "Look, we took a deep dive on you. We've looked at mikeroweWORKS really carefully. We think it is exactly what the country needs, not just the middle class, the whole country. We think that what you're talking about goes beyond organized labor and unions and all of the typical drama that puts us in this binary box where nobody can really hear the other side. He said, I think mikeroweWORKS should be macroweWORKS. And I can make it that way if you'll run with me, because then the country will see on a daily basis what you've been up to for the last 16 years, and we'll blow this thing up." And I got to admit that was tempting. And so I took a meeting. I went to his home, and I sat with him and his wife and his whole cadre of people, and we talked for a few hours. And I knew deep down I could never do it, but God help, I was kind of flattered,
Yeah.
but mostly curious. I really just wanted to see how it's possible that a guy from that family thought a kid with a stutter who sang in the opera and sold crap in the middle of the night and then crawled through a sewer for 20 years might somehow be qualified to help run the country. I couldn't help it. I just needed to know. So it was a really great conversation. I was super candid. I told him I I agree with you on a few things. I think the state of our union's physical fitness is a national scandal and maybe even a matter of national security. I think the skills gap has to be fixed. I think this whole infectious disease thing is real. And I too object to the forever wars and the way they're sold to the country. I think you're dead wrong on the environment. I can't believe how wrong you are. I was honest. And he said, "Look, man, I don't need you to agree with me on everything. In fact, I don't want you to." Very much a team of rivals approach that he was pitching, and I liked it a lot.
Yeah.
And so we stayed in touch. I became friends with his head of security, Gavin DeBecker. I don't know if you've talked to Gavin.
I haven't, but I know, of course, who he is, and he's been on your podcast.
He has, and he should be on yours. He is just a fascinating life this guy has had, and he's known Bobby for decades. And so I guess I was just kind of adjacent to the whole thing for a while, Jack. And I was honest with him too. I said, "Look, I honestly don't know how this could happen. I would have to blow up my business. I just don't know what it would mean for everything that I've worked for. And realistically, I'm no good in an office. I've never had any luck in a bureaucracy. And first and foremost, this is an executive position. And so, I just don't think I'm fundamentally qualified for it. But I'm glad we had the conversation, because in the last 2 months, I've met with the governor of South Dakota, the governor-elect of New Hampshire, their efforts and other governors' efforts to reinvigorate the skilled trades are becoming, I said earlier, it's always great when the headlines catch up to your own smack. And, whether it's a book that's suddenly made relevant by world events, or a foundation that's suddenly made relevant by every economic indicator that's screaming, "Hey, this is real now." It's happening. And so I'm I'm happy to say I don't believe I have to run for office to make a difference in this space. And I'll make no apology for the fact that I really don't want to do anything that ends with a website that has .gov on the tail end of it. I
Yeah.
just don't think it's my thing. But that's a long way of answering your question. On a selfish level, I'm way more hopeful and enthusiastic than I've been in the last 16 years that the that the new boss um, does share my view around the importance of trade schools and my suspicion of this idea that the best path for the most people is a 4-year degree. And I think whether it comes through any of the various tentacles uh, in government, I think there is going to be an opportunity to work uh, in a way I haven't worked before to accomplish the goals of the foundation. And
Wow.
that's exciting for me.
That's amazing. And you're probably, I mean, more than qualified to have served in that role as VP, with all your experience and relatability, and just who you are and that what you bring with you to whatever you do. And it's interesting. I've known Robert Kennedy for, I guess, since 2017. A friend of mine married into that family, so I got to meet him out there at the wedding, and he talked about his family's relationship with Army Special Forces. Of course, dates back to the early 60s, and that was really special. So I got to talk to him, had him on the podcast, and all those things. But interesting, I've never talked about this before, and since you did that, it reminded me of this, is that 2016, so late 2016. So I'm out of the military now for about 6 months. I've submitted the book to Simon & Schuster, but I don't think I've heard back yet. But it's right about the time I'm going to hear back. And I get a call from someone who is associated with the Trump campaign at that point, or whatever you call it, as you're getting ready to go into January of 2017. And they say, hey, don't be surprised if you get a call about your interest in doing something with ASD SOLIC. So that's Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations Low Intensity Conflict. This is before, I don't have any social media at this point. I'm just out of the military. No one knows who I am except for a few people out there in, I guess, government military circles, and know my interest in history and some things I did in the SEAL teams and that sort of a thing. And to be clear, they did not say that your name is being considered for this. That is not what they said at all. They just said, hey, don't be surprised if you get a call, just as a little warning. That call never came. So and at the time, I probably would have considered it back then. But the call never came. But in my fourth book, The Devil's Hand, I have the President of the United States offering James Reese, my protagonist, that as a way out. Hey, leave this life behind. You're pardoned for all these things. Do this thing, ASD SOLIC. You don't need to send a confirmation. You'll just do it temporary. And then you have it on your resume and you can go sit on some boards. You can live the rest of your life. You've done enough for the country, type of a thing. So it wove its way into a fictional thriller. Yeah, your story reminded me of that.
It is, I don't know what the right word is for it, but art imitating life, life imitating art. When you find yourself at the crossroads of that, I think, like for me, the first time it actually took my breath away. I was on the phone with my mom, flicking around the TV at the same time, and I stumbled across, I think it was Sex in the City. And I paused for a second because I heard something that really struck me, in particular, my voice. And the camera changes angles, and whatever's going on in the scene is going on, but in the background on the TV is Dirty Jobs. And it's so weird, Jack. It's always nice to be, honored or singled out or spoken of in flattering terms. But when you're in the background, in some cases, it's even bigger. It's even better. It's even weirder. Like when you see, whether it's an idea or a character or even your own self, woven into somebody else's story. That, for me, it wasn't just ego, although it kind of felt nice to see that. But that's when I thought, you know what? If I want to, I think I can actually really lean into this mikeroweWORKS thing.
Wow.
Because if you're out there in that way, then you're you're touching people
Yeah.
in ways that kind of go beyond your own deliberateness, you know? And that is a kind of that's probably the wrong word, but it's a kind of influence. And when you realize that maybe you have it, then your next sane thought should be, let's not screw that up.
Yeah.
Man.
Incredible. And I'm looking at the clock over here. I want to be very respectful of your time, and I sincerely appreciate you doing this with me. You have a lot of projects out there, and I don't know if you think of yourself this way or at what point you did, if you do, but you are a storyteller. And whether it's the podcast, it's the books, it's the vignettes that you say, it's the things that you guys sing on there, whether it's maybe it's for a sponsor or whatever it is that are fantastic. No one else does this.
Just so your audience knows, you're talking about the unsolicited 4-part jingles I inflict upon my audience on behalf of my advertisers.
This is it.
which by the way is just another love letter back to Fred King, who was the king of the barbershoppers. It was barbershop harmony that he kind of turned me on to in the 12th grade, which is about as far from cool, I understand, as you can possibly get. But, it's weird what sticks with you.
Yeah.
And later, if you can sort of square that circle, I just wrote one for Manscaped. I mean... it's such a small, weird, random thing, but it's out there now in 4-part harmony. Here, I'll give you the melody because I'm actually I'm kind of proud of it. Your gonads are covered with curly black hair, fuzzy and furry, they're dangling there. Your scrotum needs trimming, but don't you despair. Manscaped is here so your balls can be bare. Right. So you do that in 4-part harmony, and you blast it out there with a product that, honestly, I wouldn't even have known how to sell on QVC. A product designed to shave your scrotum. And then, so the only way life gets better and weirder around that is if you somehow have the freedom to write and harmonize with yourself around the business of men you'll never meet in the privacy of their own commodes, using a product to shave their scrotum. I just think as metaphors go, maybe that's the better answer to your excellent earlier question about what I think of the State of the Union and where we're headed. I mean, if you're really trying to combine the sublime and the ridiculous with everything that's personal and hopeful, what more lasting activity could there be than singing along in 4-part harmony as you do a little personal grooming?
Wow.
That's where we are.
Wow.
That's where our country is right now. We're trying to shave our own balls without, not bleeding out.
Well, and using the technology of the day to do so. Wow. That's what I mean. You're a storyteller. Even in that jingle right there, that's a story. And it's fantastic. And I did not expect this podcast to take that turn, but I'm so glad that it did. So grateful that it did. But you are a storyteller, and that Paul Harvey influence, you talk about it here in the book. I've heard you talk about it many times before, but at some point it becomes a part of you and all that you do, whether it's foundation, you're telling stories, whether it was Dirty Jobs, what you're doing now. There's a bunch of projects you have out there, but the book here, the way I heard it. So you go into mysteries pulled from your podcast, and we talk about Custer. We're learning about Margaret Mitchell and Gone with the Wind, a story that I love, by the way. Benedict Arnold, Jim Morrison, Simon Winchester has a great quote, and I wanted to read it because it was one of those ones that I wrote down, and it's going to stay with me as well, about the thesaurus and the dictionary.
Sure.
According to the Atlantic, good writing has little to do with finding the right word and everything to do with the brave employment of the words that one already knows. Our literary powers are born, Winchester wrote, not out of banal and mediocre suggestion, not out of these shopping lists, but out of passion, which we talked about earlier, thought and intensity of feeling, which I love. And I think those are some of those things, that heart. I think that speaks to heart. He didn't say that word, but it speaks to heart. And that's what I think makes good art great, is those ones, because you can't put your finger on it, but it has heart, as everything you do does.
the reason I wanted to include that quote in there, it's a smaller part of a larger story about Roger and the thesaurus and what it took to create this compendium of synonyms. And what Winchester was saying there is that, yes, it's a tool, but it's not the heart of what you need as a writer. I mean, you can look at Hemingway for real sparseness and precision and simplicity of language. It's a cheat to simply use the thesaurus to find a better word, because once you do it, you'll get addicted to it and then you'll be overwriting, right? And I think he was really just kind of cautioning people about that. On the other hand, if you read his quote, I mean, you stumbled over banal and a couple other big words that would be precisely what you would find in a thesaurus if you were to use it, you know. And so, look, I just think the book is called The Way I Heard It for the same reason my podcast is, which is an even better answer to your excellent earlier question. What is history but for the way we remember a thing and our willingness to scrupulously tell it and share it and pass it on and kick the tires in this endless search for the truth. But what have we learned today more than anything else? We've learned that, oh God, my truth, your truth. Well, we'll teach it this way here, we'll teach it this way there. It's all kind of up for grabs. And so, to talk about history in a way that feels and sounds certain, that's a thing that worries me. And that, I hope I didn't do it in this conversation, because it's so tempting too when we believe a thing and when we've learned a thing and when we think we know the thing, then we just embark on this journey of persuasion, and whether or not it's rooted in genuine truth or not, that seems to be the great struggle of our times right now, is to truly try and understand to what extent, if any, the 1619 project deserves to even be looked at, or should it be dismissed out of hand, and then just fill in the blanks with every other headline, whether it's a drone or new stats on immigration or new stats on, the thing that is most important to me, which right now is 7 million able-bodied men choosing not to work. What the hell's going on with that? $1.7 trillion in student loans on the books, 8 million open positions that don't require a 4-year degree, and here we are still pushing kids into this same miasma of tautological madness. What are we doing? So look, you might have heard it different. That's the way I heard it, and that's what I'm going with, and that's the country we're living in right now. A lot of people armed with a lot of facts and an absolute level of conviction that keeps the conversation lively.
Exactly. It goes back to the importance of being that student. And other people in this thing: Rod Sterling, you have William Randolph Hearst, you have Bob Dylan, Bonnie Parker, John Wayne, David Bowie, Ted Williams, Agatha Christie. I love that chapter in here, by the way. Jim Croce, love that one as well. I love his work. Bob Ross, Charles Manson, James Dean. This is quite the eclectic group of characters here. And John D. MacDonald, of course, and Travis McGee. Got this one right here. The is a first edition, and it's not signed, but it is a first edition. And I know you have an affinity.
Is that the Deep Blue Goodbye?
This is the Green Ripper. And,
the Green Ripper. That's a great one.
Yeah, here's the Deep Blue Goodbye is right here. This is a more recent edition, obviously. Nightmare in Pink right here. But I love how you weave him into your podcast stories that you tell into the book right here. And as I grabbed this one off the shelf, this one hadn't really registered with me, but someone gave this as a gift in 1979. So that's when this book was actually written, in 1979, or when it was published. And someone here gives this as a gift. Happy birthday, Nancy and Dari, November 79. And then this guy, Woody Speed, underneath it. right here. So I'm guessing this is a quote from someone named Woody Speed. I did not look him up, but it says, attitude is the difference between an adventure and an ordeal. And I thought that's pretty poignant, especially with what comes next in the pages of most of the John D. MacDonald novels that I know that you love.
Well, I do love them so much, and that's just there are a lot of different ways to say embrace the suck. You know, and I think that's another version of it. But yeah, man, thanks for mentioning all those people. This will just go to my own, I don't know, maybe it's insecurity or whatever it is. The publisher wanted a memoir, and I don't think I'm in any position to write one yet. But I understand why publishers want those things. And I was currently working on this short storytelling, Paul Harvey kind of, history as mystery format. And I said, look, I'm not gonna stop doing those things just because I owe you a book. But what if I give you a memoir that is rooted in autobiography? So biography and autobiography combined. So basically what this book happened because I was determined to write about people I'd never met, but was interested in. And then I realized that if I do that in a short story format, it would remind me and rhyme in some way with something that happened to me in along the way. And so that was really the query. Like, what would happen if I told you a story about a famous person that you're familiar with, a story you'd never heard before about someone you know, followed by the reason I wanted to write that? And if I could find a connection between, say, John Wayne and Deadliest Catch, which is now, by the way, they just picked up season 21.
Amazing.
Unbelievable.
Amazing.
So, if you live long enough, you start seeing yourself in other people. You start seeing your mistakes in other people's mistakes, and you start seeing your little triumphs in other people's triumphs. And if you can somehow, for me anyway, if you can combine those things, then you make the famous people more relatable, and you make the anonymous people more apocryphal and more consequential. And that is yet another answer to your excellent question posed a half hour ago. What's going on in our country? I think to some degree, what's going on right now, as in today, I literally just read a really interesting piece about the diminishment of celebrity, which fascinates me. Like, if you think about what happened after Trump won the first time, Martin Sheen and Deborah Messing and half a dozen people came out, and they led this giant campaign to persuade the electors, Republican electors, to not cast their vote for Trump. For the sake of democracy, a campaign was launched to completely undermine the democratic process. That's fascinating, right? And not to make it political, I don't care who you voted for, but what is it about the celebrity today that makes him or her think that anybody really gives a tinker's damn about what they believe about something that so has nothing to do with their chosen field? I think it's amazing. I know the answer. It's because we pay attention to everything they do. So why wouldn't we pay attention to their opinions on their politics? And so every year when I'm invited to participate in a rock the vote event or this or that, or this year was the biggie. You get a call from a candidate who wants you to join the ship. It's like I always look at that through the lens of notoriety and say, man, that's such an odd, powerful thing. So I guess my point is, as we've done nothing but elevate celebrity over the last couple of decades, isn't it interesting right now to realize what a tiny impact they had. I mean, I'm talking about 10, 12 years ago. Look at what just happened. What did Oprah Winfrey get her? What did Taylor Swift get her? What did all of it? They came out in force again. Hollywood came out in force again, and the American people either yawned or gave them the finger. So when I think about the diminishment of celebrity, and when I imagine or believe, as I do, that every action does have an equal and opposite reaction, well, wouldn't that also mean the ascendancy of the common man in some way? Isn't that going to have to happen in order to make the pendulum equal? And if so, then I do understand why Bobby called me, because I've spent the last 22 years tapping the country on the shoulder and saying, hey, what about him? What about her? Get a load of that.
Yeah.
Here's a job you didn't know existed, being performed by a man you will never meet in a town you can't find on a map, but whose work nevertheless impacts your life.
Yeah.
How about that shit? Right? That's what's going on in our country. The thing we've been focused on has been revealed to be less important than we thought. And the things we've ignored, we're beginning to realize may be far more important than we ever imagined. Trade schools might somehow be right at the center of this whole sticky wicket. And I think in the coming years, we're going to see a recalibration of all of it. I don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but again, it's going to be fun to watch.
Wow. Yeah. Well, AI is not going to come and fix a plumbing issue for you. AI could replace a CEO of a major corporation by looking at data and making informed decisions based off said data.
What do you think about it, Jack? Like when you look at the impact that it's going to have on literature,
Yeah.
are you thinking of it as a tool? Are you thinking of it as a Trojan horse that we stupidly let in through the gates? What do you think?
Well, if it is a tool, I look at it as in terms of an assistant. So being able, instead of asking a physical person, hey, can you do some research on whatever, the civil rights movement or VE Day or whatever that is, and give me a one-page paper, a two-page paper that focuses on X, Y, or Z specifically. Boom. So instead of having that kind of an assistant, which I don't have, but some do, now maybe you can ask that of one of these ChatGPT or those types of things. So I see that as the tool side. I haven't used it like that. I don't think I'm technically capable of doing even that. I have enough problems just with normal passwords for a Netflix or Amazon on TV, just trying to find something at the end of the day and sit down with my wife and have a glass of wine and watch something. And meanwhile, our stress levels start going through the roof and anxieties. We're trying to think which password is attached to what email and all of that. So I can barely do Word on my computer. So I'm going to stick old school because I feel like that's where, I don't know, that's where my roots are. Back in growing up in the 80s, and I'm going to stick with that sort of a thing. But you could look at it as competition. So now someone can say, hey, write me a novel about a thriller about this, include these elements, have a character named so-and-so, have a background of this, and let's see how it turns out. And maybe it gives that person a rough draft, and maybe they turn into something great. I don't know. But there is that thing that we talked about earlier called heart. And that is the thing that even with all the technology out there or all the information that has been built up over time that allows you to make a decision or that informs whatever you're doing in whatever capacity you're doing it in, whatever industry you're doing it in, still you can miss that heart piece of it. And that's the part that you cannot replicate, I do not think, through some sort of an artificial entity.
Well, I think that since you mentioned all industries, just bring it back to the sweatshirt you're wearing and the shirt that I'm wearing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was a time when I think the first great panic around technology was probably the Gutenberg printing press.
Mm-hmm.
right? When the king realized, oh my God, I'll never get the crap back in the goose. Now everybody is going to be able to read the same thing, and that's a real threat to power. It was the Luddite revolution with the loomers and the textiles that made people who used to make shirts hand dyed by hand, like the loomers went into a full panic because these giant looms that were coming in, I think it was the weaving union rose up and they were like, well, if you've got a machine that can do what we've been doing, our entire industry, you know, is based on this. There's just no way. There's just no way this is going to end well. We're screwed as weavers, thanks to the invention of the loom. Of course, that wasn't exactly the case, but if you flash forward till today, you can see that sweatshirt costs $140. Now, it shouldn't. Americans ought to be able to buy an American-made sweatshirt for a third of that. But for all kinds of reasons, we can't. And so, thankfully, we're a big country with many, many micro markets. And so we can make our choices as our own economic circumstances dictate and so forth. But when I think about AI, I kind of think of it that way. And I don't ultimately know what it's going to mean, but somebody sent me a link the other day. They asked some chat service to narrate a couple of paragraphs in the style of Mike Rowe doing Deadliest Catch.
Oh, wow.
And I clicked and I listened. And I'll tell you what, if I didn't know what it was, I would have just said, yeah, I guess that's something I did a few years ago and just forgot about.
Wow.
And that's today. 6 months from now, I think it'll probably be seamless.
Yeah.
But for me, the question is, what happens when it gets to the point that I can hand you an undiscovered manuscript by Ernest Hemingway, and you read it and say, my God, that was great. And then I say, yeah, well, actually, it wasn't undiscovered. It was just manufactured by AI. So we've basically taken the art out of Hemingway's world. What happens when I can do that with a Manet or a Monet or a Renoir or a Degas or a Picasso? What happens when the machines can create a thing that no art authenticator can differentiate? And so, I just heard some crazy country music song a couple days ago that is purely the version or the function of AI, and it was good. It was good. So I love it as an assistant. I love the idea that it can help take care of some of the grunt work that leads right up to the part where the art happens. But why would it stop there?
Good point. Yeah, already there are people. There's a fairly prominent author who publicly says that he uses an app that turns his sentences into sentences in the style of Hemingway. I was like, what? Why would you want to admit that? But yeah, that's just a weird thing. I want to be able to take, whether it's good or bad, whether people love it or hate it, I know it's mine. So that I like that. Which screenwriting is, a little different, where it's a team and you get notes all the way up to the head of Amazon, back down, very team oriented. Even if there's only one name or two names on said script, it's really a team effort. Yeah. I'm gonna stick with just doing it myself. Thank goodness. But this next generation that comes up, when that becomes normal to have their art made by a machine,
our default is to think about how we want to make it, because we think of ourselves. I'm talking about you and me specifically, and anybody else who's ever sat down to try and write a book or paint a portrait or compose a song. Anybody who's in the business of making a thing is going to default to the impact of AI on the business of making. But the truth is, we're in the minority. Like, the vast majority of people don't publish books or write songs or create TV shows or paint portraits. They consume them. They enjoy them. So the bigger question, and one that I don't think has been asked a lot, And maybe another answer to your earlier excellent question about what's going on in our country is that we have to figure out how much we value that which is authentic. And by that, it's the matrix. If you're in the matrix and you're eating the meat and it's not really meat and you're not even really eating it, but you think you are you going to make that deal? If that portrait on your wall that you purchased decades ago that you love so much, when you learn that it's a forgery, does it diminish your love for it? And if so, why? Why? So I that Beatles song they just discovered. This is just like I was talking about with the Hemingway book. How we need to decide as consumers of art and just participants in commerce how much we value the real thing.
Yeah.
And that's something 330 million individuals are going to have to decide for themselves over here.
Yeah. Well, when did explicit lyric stamps come out on tapes and CDs? Late 80s, early 90s, something like
Tipper
that?
Gore? Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe there's a non-AI or an AI generated stamp that's going to go, so you can make your own decision as a consumer. You might love the AI stuff and that's your thing, but you know it and you haven't been tricked into liking something or even reading something, watching something, looking at something, hanging something in your apartment or home that you think was made by humans, but was in fact made by a machine. So maybe there's an explicit lyrics that's going to go on those, so you can choose as the consumer.
Well, look, I think NFTs, right? Non-fungible tokens.
Right.
I think it's super weird, but it kind of makes sense in a world that's looking for referees to be told this is one of one. This is an original.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, I think there's value to it. I think the whole art world, Malcolm Gladwell did a pretty good takedown, or at least observation, on the need for referees obviously in sports, but in so many things, and art in particular. Like if you can't authenticate that Salvador Mundi was in fact painted by Rembrandt, in fact, if your best attempts indicate that it wasn't, then the guy that paid $550 million for it is going to have something to say. and I think there's a pretty good case to be made right now that, like, in the world of fine art, so much of the value is based on the belief that you're looking at an authentic thing.
Yeah.
You might as well write "In God We Trust" on the back of all of it, because it's just like the money.
Yeah.
We have to believe that the thing we're looking at represents what it claims to. When it doesn't, people get anxious.
Sure. Well, very similar to, let's say you had a mentor or someone who growing up really influenced you, and later on you find out that they had told some stories that didn't really, didn't add up once you got a little older. They had lied, but I think it's kind of the same thing. You feel betrayed by that entity, by that person, whether you knew them or not, whether maybe it's someone you look up to and you don't even know them, but you've read their books or whatever it might be. And then you find out, oh, this person was a bit of a fraud. You feel a bit betrayed. Same thing with that artwork that you love that's hanging in your home, and 20 years later you find out it was done by some machine and isn't really that thing that you thought it was for 20 years. That's a betrayal right there.
Well, it goes the other way too, and it comes out in a lot of the little short stories that I try and write, but it's the cognitive dissonance that occurs when you realize, or when you learn that Hitler liked dogs a lot. He was an animal lover, old Adolf was, and a painter. He liked to paint. So if I tell you a story about a dog lover who likes to paint that turns out to be Hitler, your head explodes a little bit, because you're like, no, wait. I need my villains to all be villainous. I need my mentors to all be virtuous. I need my writers once John D. McDonald establishes Travis McGee, I need Travis to comport with the character you created. If James Reese all of a sudden, starts to explore his sexuality in new and exciting transitional ways, then your fans are going to be like, "Hey, man, what?" Well, but you are James Reese. You're in charge, but now you owe this debt of sorts to your fans. When Jim Carrey did Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, a lot of people were like, "Well, where'd my comedian go?" And Adam Sandler, what are you doing being all serious and uncut gems? We have a really hard time, Jack, when the people we think we know just verge a little bit out of their lane. And I'm not comparing myself to any of those people, but not a day goes by for me when somebody says, "What? The dirty jobs guy can't hang drywall effectively? He sang in the opera? He sold what on the QVC cable shopping channel? Wait a minute. The guy who's telling us we need to reinvigorate trade schools was in not one or two or 10, but like 20 infomercials? He sold cleaning products?" So people struggle.
Yeah.
They they want to believe that the thing they've come to know is weirdly simplistic and predictable. That's it. It's predictable. But why should we be surprised when we learn that our mentors had feet of clay? It really should be the opposite. Who among us doesn't? Who among us isn't going to let down the people who love us most? Only everybody.
Oh man. And then, but quickly going back, we have some people that it does work out for. When you talked about those guys who did take that turn, we have Tom Hanks in the 80s, all comedies. I don't know of one that wasn't. And then early 90s, we get A Risk with Philadelphia. And so that risk allows him then to be in, do all these other projects, Saving Private Ryan and everything else that he's done. So it did open the door. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but there is that comfort in knowing that when you turn on, let's say, a Sylvester Stallone movie, or you're going to get what you have tuned in for. And there's comfort in that.
That's right. Look, man, that's the point. I mean, if this whole conversation has a point, I think it's, and I mean, look, I think this is one of the finest conversations I've had in weeks, Jack. I'll stand by all of it. But that's it, man. You just summed it up. What are we to do when Sly Stallone, the musical, comes out? Now, I think when you were describing Tom's career, that's the reason people talk about breaking out. How did you break out? Well, people only say that to the exceptions. Because most people don't. Most people get into their life and they become the thing they do. They become defined by all sorts of different things. But what we're doing today, as people who consume art, we have to decide what's authentic. But as people who are alive and who are a product of our history, we also have to decide what was true and what mattered. And what better metaphor is there than the desire to tear down a statue that stood there for 200 years, but now suddenly has become problematic for a certain group of people in a certain moment in time who desperately want to make the world a better place, improve the present as well as the future, and conclude that the only rational way to do so is to tear Thomas Jefferson off the face of Rushmore. Yeah. Now, how do you unpack that? How do you think rationally about that? It's been happening for the last 10, 12 years, and it'll probably continue to happen. But the truth is, it's been happening for millennia. The Greeks called it damnation memore, or damnio memore, I think it was, where they wouldn't rip the statue down. They would deface it and let it stand. When they learned, to use your metaphor, that their mentors weren't all that, or if their heroes had done something that was no longer palatable to the civilized mind, right? What do we do? Well, in this country, we remove the statues. Once upon a time, the Greeks just scratched out their faces and let them stand as an example of changing times. And plenty of other civilizations don't do anything. You know, the rational ones, they just say, look, this, whoever we are today is a reflection of where we've come from and how we've evolved. And a statue is not necessarily a celebration of a person any more than Time's Person of the Year is a rubber stamp on approval. It is, however, a remembrance of impact. And so, yeah, we're twisted up, I think, in that way, and somewhere in there is this desire for real authenticity, but also I think this deep desire for our heroes to have been truly heroic, and for our villains to have been truly villainous. And the more nuanced that becomes in the way we remember our past and in the way we think about our future, then I think the more two-dimensional and less interesting we become.
Like kids need heroes today, especially that 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade time frame right there. They need heroes. And that's why when someone talks about a SEAL book or an Army Special Forces book or whatever else, how do I feel about that? Well, I feel that kid reading that book in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade needs to be reading that book and needs to respect what these guys sacrificed, because they need that inspiration now more than ever with all the inputs coming in that are controlling their thoughts and behaviors. But yeah, taking it back to Sylvester Stallone, to be fair, he did try Stop or My Mom Will Shoot and Oscar back in the day, and quickly pivoted back to what he's good at. I got to talk with him, actually. He wanted to talk to me about a project and about doing a project together, which was so flattering. I took some pictures off to the side of the screen, so he couldn't see it, and I got a good picture of us all when we weren't talking. And he was fantastic, wise, humble, kind, thoughtful, just an amazing guy. I wrote something.
Are you watching Tulsa Kings?
And I watched not the second season yet because I'm past my deadline here for the latest book, but I will go back to it when I finish said book. But yeah, I just I'm a huge fan of his, and wrote something up for him that whether he does it or not, I'll turn it into a book at some point because it is a good idea. But yeah, so he did try to branch out there, but he quickly realized, and he said this in our conversation too. He said that he knows what he is good at, and he wants to do more of that as he continues on here, which was, it was pretty cool and humbling to do.
Have you talked to Josh Smith yet?
Oh yeah. I know him, the Montana Knife Company. I carved the Thanksgiving turkey with one of his blades. Oh, nice. I just got all the steak knives the other day. So
I got them all too.
Nice. They're so good. But those steak knives are great.
He gave me the whole chef's
set.
Yep. In the unfolding thing. And
Yep.
then I called him back and I'm like, hey man, I got to do something for you. But the easiest thing to do is if you do a fundraiser for mikeroweWORKS. And he's like, well, what's it look like? I'm like, it's basically a custom blade that is like a just super useful, super utilitarian blade.
Nice.
But he put the MRW logo on there.
Oh, awesome.
And gave me 300.
Nice.
We raised $62,000 in 2 hours.
Nice.
And everybody who didn't get one went to his site and just sold him out of everything.
Awesome.
So he's like, hey man, let's do like a special working man dirty jobs blade. Let's do the whole I said, sure.
Yep.
And I mentioned his name on Rogan the other day.
Oh, nice.
And it blew up again. So I'm just so amazed by the community, this whole podcast world. It's just such a kick, man.
Yeah. A lot of good people. Out there doing that. And Josh Smith is great. Joe's great. We've gone to hunting together a few times now, and it's just good. A lot of good people out there.
You and Rogan went hunting, or you and Josh?
Rogan. Yeah, yeah. I've done it before I was ever on the show. Before I had a book, he was out. I have a hunting operation out in Lanai, Hawaii, called Pineapple Brothers. So there's 3 or 4 of us. One's a silent partner, so we have that out there. He's been out there a few times, and then we went on an elk hunt out here in Utah. I was supposed to go again this September, but I was so far behind on things, and I was launching the Beirut book, so I couldn't go link up this last September. But next September maybe.
Well, I can't wait to dig into that. But should I be getting venison from that company?
We don't sell it because we don't have the USDA person on Lanai. There are 2 on Maui, and there's a company on Maui, which is probably the one you're thinking of, called Maui Nui. And that's the one. So they have 2 USDA inspectors, which need to be there when you take the animal and do all the paperwork. And we don't have one on Lanai, unfortunately. So you have to go there to Lanai to actually hunt the animal and then ship it home, which is a little more involved than just placing an order online from Maui Nui. But understand their stuff is very good. They sent me out some things last year, and they were wonderful.
Well, I've been meaning to do it, and I just haven't. Oh, look at this stuff. Boom. Sorry.
Hey, look at that. Either. Oh, nice. Awesome. Yeah. Awesome. Right there. Thank you.
Dude, it's so funny. Cool. I was looking around for it. I couldn't find it because it's holding up the piano that I have to write jingles on now.
That is so fantastic. I love it. Oh my gosh. Amazing. But we're talking Hollywood. And so we have this project, Something to Stand For. And tell me a little bit about that. You have, and I'm going to read this so you don't have to just regurgitate this part, and I can just get your thoughts on it. Join America's favorite storyteller on an epic journey to the heart of Washington, D.C. Drawing from his blockbuster podcast, The Way I Heard It, the cinematic tour de force will take viewers to the front lines of the American Revolution, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, and more. Part mystery, part history. Each harrowing tale tells a story you've never heard about the patriots who built our country. From the legendary rebels we call the Founding Fathers to unknown Marines of Iwo Jima, these are the Americans who risked everything to build the country we love and call home. The American heroes who gave us something to stand for. I love that little blurb. But how did this all come about, and what drew you to this project? Because now you can choose your projects, I would think, at this stage. What drew you to this one?
Well, everything we've discussed so far is a part of it. It's just a stop on a pretty weird trek. But this one, it began with the podcast and my belief that while I could never hope to fill the shoes of Paul Harvey or Charles Kuralt or Studs Terkel or any of those great storytellers, I could follow in their footsteps, and so with the Harvey thing, it was all about, you certainly know as a writer, it's a hell of a lot harder to write a short story than it is a long one,
The Mark Twain quote, actually. Yeah.
Very tough. But I just started it because it was a fun challenge. Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story was the format that I followed. I used to write on planes. I wrote that book on a plane.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, I read on planes as well because I think it's because I never signed into the Wi-Fi, and that's the one time when there are less people bugging me, depending on who's. I shouldn't say that. Less people interrupting me on a flight, and I can just get in there. I don't do the Wi-Fi, so there's not even that in the back of my mind, the possibility of me missing a text or an email because I'm not looking. I can't look.
You can't.
Technologically speaking, I'm not connected for this 3-hour, 4-hour flight.
It's a great paradox, though. Like, you are surrounded by people, and you're surrounded by noise.
Yeah.
There's interruptions, there are people talking behind you, there's all sorts of stuff. But it's kind of like sleep. If it's perfectly quiet, I have a tough time going to sleep. And if it's perfectly quiet, I have a tough time writing. And if there's nothing going on, it just feels like more pressure. You sit down, you get everything arranged, you get your coffee just so, and now it's time to write.
That's time.
Yeah, that's pressure. But for me, I could write these stories in between SFO and JFX. And the beauty of it is, and I'm sure this has happened to you too, when you're doing something you're really immersed in, it will compress time. And how many times did I sit down on the tarmac of SFO to start a story only to look up 10 minutes later and see that I'm at JFK. So I loved the way writing helped me pass the time. I wrote the stories purely to amuse myself. My buddy Chuck, who you met, who is a producer on my
Yep.
podcast, and a guy that I sang in a quartet with 45 years ago, for God's sakes.
Amazing.
He's like, hey, man, this whole podcast world is a thing. Let's throw them out there. A few 100 million people downloaded them. So I kept writing them. And then a publisher, your publisher,
Yeah.
said, hey, maybe these should be a book. And then a TV guy said, hey, maybe these could be reenacted into shows. And so we did 7 seasons of something called The Story Behind the Story, all based on my attempts to compress time in a pressurized aluminum tube. And then earlier this year, a guy said, look, I love these stories, and some of them are really inappropriate for families. Some of them are just whatever. I mean, I love the fact that it's a mosaic, but he said my favorite ones are the ones about America's patriots.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of them. You know, like I think I wrote a couple hundred, and he said, I got 9 here that I think would do really well on the big screen. Do you want to do a movie? And one of those stories was called Something to Stand For. It was a rumination on, well, actually, I wrote it not long after the Colin Kaepernick drama unfolded, and it seemed like the country couldn't decide when to kneel or when to stand. So that wound up becoming the title of this movie that was stitched together by a trip to D.C., where I basically reacquainted myself with the monuments and memorials that, you know, I grew up not far from there. And it was amazing to me. I realized I hadn't been in the National Mall in 30 years. So I went with a film crew, and I walked around, and I talked to park rangers, and I went to Arlington, and I went to all the big memorials, most of which rhymed with the stories that I had written. And we stitched it together, and it was only out for a week. It was for Independence Day, but it did really well. And God, this will sound awfully douchey of me, but I believe it has a 98% on Rotten Tomatoes, Jack.
Hey.
And it's streaming over on the Angel Guild.
Yeah.
So yeah, man, I didn't set out to make a movie. This movie happened because I set out to pass the time on a United flight.
Wow.
And things got out of hand, as they often do.
Yeah, I do have some short stories in the future, not too distant future, I think. But as I think about them, I think of that Mark Twain quote, and it's something along the lines of, "I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one," type of a thing.
I'm sorry this letter is so long.
There it is.
If I had more time, it would have been shorter.
There it is. Yeah, that's it. I mean,
That's it.
There's something to it. Or novellas gives you a little more leeway, but that's a little longer than a short story for those listening and not familiar. But yeah, there's something to it about that, and you're so good at it in these books. They're so great and so approachable too, which is fantastic. You hear some of these names in here, and you're like, oh, geez, the full-on book about whoever, and it's this thick, and it's a little not approachable. You can use it as a doorstop.
This is the shallow end of the pool. And really, you know, I wanted to make that point before when you said that, you know, kids need to be reading these books because they need their heroes. I agree completely. But I think sometimes there's a tendency to try and do too much in one book. You know, so many people want to write the great transformational novel, or they want to do whatever. And it's like, hey, great. Good luck. I mean, maybe if you're Faulkner or Fitzgerald, you'll pull off Gatsby. I don't know, but it's hard. You know, that's why there are many books. This book does this. This book does that.
Yeah.
And now today, being connected as we are, I see stories more as portals. So, you know, if I can keep you for 8 minutes and get you interested to learn more about somebody that you thought you knew, but you really don't, then it's just a click away to go into a deeper part of the pool. a deeper end of the pool, I suppose you could say. So I got enamored of that format because I love things with a beginning and a middle and an end. It goes back to dirty jobs and most dirty jobbers. You don't have to ask them how they're doing. You can just look at the work and you can see their progress, you know. And so it's very satisfying to start a story, get into it, make your points, and then when you finish it right, I mean, maybe this has happened for you. It for me, it almost feels like you close a box, like a perfectly made box, like this
Ooh,
one.
look at
You know,
that.
it makes a sound
Yeah.
when it closes just right, and it's very satisfying and very addictive.
Yeah.
And so, and again, I'm not an expert really in anything, but I am curious about a lot of the same people everybody listening is curious about.
Yeah.
And if I can find something you didn't know about them
Oh, yeah.
and write a mystery from the inside out, it's simple, but it's complicated at the same time, and it's fun.
Yeah.
And so in the end, if it turns into a book or a TV show or a movie, it just kind of proves the point. There's an appetite for it.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, people want to hear a story well told.
Well, it's important too, and we've been storytellers from the beginning of time. Pass down lessons of the hunt, pass along lessons of warfare, so the next generation doesn't have to learn those same lessons in blood. And those stories are all part of that tradition. And you're a continuation of that tradition. There's inspiration behind this as well, because not everyone can maybe make that trek to go to the National Mall or go to the USS Arizona Memorial or go to Arlington Cemetery. I took our 14-year-old as part of the Army Navy game to Arlington. We got to go behind the scenes and see where the guards that guard Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, where they get ready and what they do before they walk out there to stand that post. And we got to visit friends of mine that are out there that are buried in Arlington, and stopped by the Beirut Memorial that's out there in Section 59, right next to Section 60, where there are a lot of GWAT people who are killed in the GWAT. But to sit there and
Congrats on the book, Jack.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for the copy.
Absolutely.
It's on the top of my stack. I don't have time to read anymore, but during this break, I've got 2 weeks, and that's first up.
Thank you. That was an emotional one. And going to the memorial there, and to take him there, because he's seen me working on this book, saw me go on book tour for this book, heard me talking about this book over dinner, and about the people that I was meeting and interviewing. It was an emotional one. And I get emotional in my thrillers. And if I know I'm getting emotional at certain points, I know I'm doing something right, because it has that heart, that piece right there. But this, you can't make a mistake, because people are still alive who lost loved ones, who lost brothers, who lost sons, who lost fathers. And I had people coming through the line at book signings that had a picture of their father or of their son who died that day. And there were hugs, there were tears, there were thank yous, and we took pictures holding that photo of their father who died in October of 1983. It was emotional to write. It was emotional to do those interviews. It was emotional to then do the lead up to book publication and talk about all those stories over and over again, because these guys are having that worst day of their life. If they survived, you're asking them to go back there to tell that to you, digging through the rubble with their bare hands, K-bar knives, maybe a shovel or a crowbar if they could find it, holding the hands of someone who's expiring that they cannot get to just because they're slowly being crushed and they don't have the machinery to move these huge chunks of concrete off them. And all they can do is just hold that hand sticking up through the rubble to let that person know that they're not dying alone. And you have to talk about those stories in every interview. And then on stage, when you're doing the book tour, same thing. And then family members are there in the audience. And it was extremely emotional. But
And personal.
it was very personal, very personal. And there's parallels to today, of course, to leaving Afghanistan in August of 2021, putting our tactical level soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in tactically disadvantageous positions, put there by people in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away from that battlefield, similar to what happened in October 83, similar to what happened in August of 2021. So it's... But we got to go there. My son got to see that stuff, and especially today for him and his generation, where they're being bombarded with those things we talked about earlier, for him to be able to take a breath, not have his phone out, be very respectful, to have met some Medal of Honor recipients the night before, now to be here walking amongst those stones, those gravestones in Arlington National Cemetery, and seeing these different memorials. It was powerful. It was powerful, but books can do that too. They can inspire people to then go to these places. And books are readily available. There's libraries all across the country where they can go and get these different books and learn about these different places and these people from the past, and can inspire them to then go forward and go to these places in the future and pass those lessons along through those stories to the next generation, to their kids, or their circle of influence.
Stephen King called them time machines.
They're time machines. Did he call them time machines? I did not
Yeah.
know that he called them that, but that was my speech for the Simon & Schuster 100th year anniversary, where I spoke this last spring, and my whole speech was about these books being time machines and going back to the time and the place they were written, if they were contemporary thrillers of the day, but going back to Ian Fleming of the 50s, and that's a time machine back to the 50s.
Oh, that's what John D. McDonald is. It's
Exactly.
It's a time machine to the late 60s in South Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you really get that part right, it's like the characters and the plot, of course, are the guts of the story. But when you write in such a way that the geography
Mm-hmm.
becomes right there with you, like you have to do that if you're taking somebody to a strange land. But you don't have to do it if you're writing about Boston. But if you can do it, you should. Like Robert Parker in his whole Spencer
Sure.
series
Oh, yeah.
makes Boston as much a character as Hawk or Spencer.
Oh, yeah.
McDonald does the same thing. McGee is his hero, but the palette is Florida. And Florida at a time that when you or I wouldn't remember. We never saw it. But when suddenly you can read about what the author is sort of prognosticating about. And now you get, 50 years later, oh my God, isn't it a kick when you stumble across somebody who called it all right? I mean, McDonald talked about the flight from the north to Florida.
Yeah.
He talked about the politics. He talked about the corruption. He talked about all the elected officials up to their well-cologned armpits in the public till. He wrote about his deep suspicion of everything. He called them the servo mechanisms and credit cards and easy payments, and down the list it goes. And then he says, finally, the quote that wound up as one of my epigrams in that book
I saw.
was, I'm wary of a great many things, but above all, I am wary of earnestness.
I saw that. Yeah.
He was right about all of it.
Yeah. It's remarkable.
All of it.
It's remarkable.
Travis McGee was just one of the greatest. He was one of the greatest fictional characters ever created.
Mm-hmm.
But he was also the inspiration for my entire business model before Dirty Jobs.
I read a little bit about that. You talk about that a bit in the book, and I love that. That was so fascinating to read that. I absolutely love that part of it. Incredible.
Yeah.
I have a couple ideas that I'll tell you about offline at some point, but that do a similar thing inspired by Travis McGee that might take place in the area of the world where you are right now.
I would love to talk with you
Yeah,
about that.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
look, I think that it's so funny. Why I was thinking about this the other day. McGee was the ultimate freelancer.
Mm-hmm.
He never, ever, ever would have been tied down by anything that resulted in a W-2. And he took his retirement in early installments, which I love too, because why wait till you're too old to enjoy it? So the guy works when funds run low, he goes out and he works again. And when I think about freelancing, and when I think about the etymology of that word, right? I mean, the knight who served no lord, his lance was not free as in inexpensive, but he was free to work with anybody who hired him that he liked.
Yeah.
And when I think about the war on freelancing today, when I think about AB 5 and some of these bills, the PRO Act, that are specifically designed to destroy people's ability to freelance, man, what what would McGee do with that? What would he rant and rave with about that? It would really be fun. But that's what's happening too. To answer your earlier question, in our country, we're struggling to define the definition of a good job, and we're trying to figure out what it means to work fairly. I don't know how gigging and freelancing got such a terrible rep. Well, actually, I do know, but I'm surprised that people don't fight back for it, because it's a wonderful way to make a living.
Yeah.
It's a little scary, but it's the best way to go.
And to live. I mean, a lot of these characters that we identify with live those kind of lives. Even go to a Magnum PI in Hawaii, growing up in the 80s, watching Tom Selleck live that life out there. But I mean, listen to this first sentence right here. 1, Meyer came aboard the Busted Flush on a dark, wet, windy Friday afternoon in early December. I just love it. I mean,
I'm in.
I'm in. Fantastic.
And of course, Meyer is his best friend, who is an economist. His boat is named after John Maynard Keynes. And these two, McDonald creates a world for this boat bum and self-appointed knight errant can have the most sophisticated kinds of conversations imaginable with this character who owns a boat 2 slips down. You just would never imagine it happening. This is tough to find, Jack, but if you Google it, it's out there. It's called Reading for Survival. It's very short.
Okay.
And it's by McDonald, and he was asked to write about why it's so important to read. And he became very frustrated because he just couldn't do it without sounding like a scold. And he didn't want to give a lecture.
Right.
So after wrestling with it for weeks, he finally gives up and just writes about he completes the assignment as a conversation between Meyer and McGee.
I love it. That's
Reading for Survival.
Brilliant. I can't believe I haven't read that. I'll be getting that later today. That's fine. And of course, Travis Me always gets the girl as well. So that's,
Well, you know what though? He always pays for it too.
Yes, good point.
McDonald doesn't leave him off the hook. Like, unlike Jack Reacher, too. Like, Travis can take care of himself. He's scrappy. He's strong. People underestimate him. But he doesn't always win. He gets hit over the head a lot.
Yeah.
He gets shot once in a while.
I love that.
Yeah. He's, McGee.
His resiliency.
Yes.
Good lessons there. So that's good lessons. Going back to the power of popular culture, you have someone in 6th, 7th, 8th grade reading this book, so reading fiction, but the lesson that they're getting is that in resiliency, kind of like watching Raiders of the Lost Ark in the early 80s as a 10-year-old or 9-year-old or 8-year-old or something like that. You're seeing Indy just take beating after beating after beating as he's going after this thing. And wow, what is that? But that's teaching something because it's becoming a part of you.
Well, sure. You can watch that and go, I've never grabbed a golden idol seconds before a big ball started rolling at me, but I have got the shit knocked out of me before. I can do that.
Yeah, exactly. But it becomes part of your experience. Certainly part of mine and for being in the SEALs or what I'm doing right now, it's all part of that foundation that you talked about earlier, that foundation. And anything you do is now a part of your foundation upon which to build. And you get to decide whether you're going to be standing in that foundation and it's going to harden around your feet, or you're going to continue to build on that. And that's everyone's individual choice in this country. We won the lotto just by being born here, I feel. And I've always thought that since I was a little kid. But being able to build off that foundation rather than getting mirrored in it, that's two distinctly different ways to go about living life. And unfortunately, you see a lot of people who get stuck in that foundation because of a past experience. And
it will harden around you.
It will.
The foundation will harden around your feet. The concrete doesn't work for you, only in the planning stage. But once you pour it, you work for the concrete.
Oh, yeah.
It's chemistry, and it will harden, whether you're standing in it or not.
Oh, yeah. I saw so many guys have a hard time leaving the SEAL teams because it's such a powerful, visceral experience that you cannot duplicate on the outside. Preparing to go to war, going to war, depending on the guys to your right and left who also happen to be your best friends, and then you get home and you want to move on to something else. I think you need to realize, and it doesn't have to be the SEAL teams, it could be any transition in life, that what comes next is not going to be exactly like what came before. And I saw a lot of guys have that cement harden around their feet because they couldn't build on that foundation. It happens in sports, happens after a divorce, the death of a loved one, could happen, job change. My experience just happens to be the SEAL teams, but I saw that happen. And that's one of the reasons that we live up here in Park City, Utah, because I wanted to make a physical and psychological break with the military and not be going to the same bars, restaurants, grocery stores, dropping kids off at the same schools as were people who were still in the SEAL teams that were going downrange to do the job. So I saw guys have a hard time leaving and decided, I'm going to build off this foundation rather than stay just mired in it.
You mentioned Medal of Honor recipients. I interviewed Clint Romeshay.
Yeah, I saw he was on your. I don't know him, but I saw that he was on your podcast.
He's terrific.
Amazing.
And
wow.
Yeah, that would have been a good metaphor. I wish I'd have thought to bring it up because I think a lot of people do feel that way when they come out of any intense situation, whether it could be teachers, anybody who just retires from a thing that had such a neatly ordered sense of certainty, and then all of a sudden they don't. And, throw into that mortal stakes, right? And your best friends and some of them not coming back. I said to Clint, it never ceases to amaze me how the military will spend so much energy preparing you to enter this new world and how little they'll spend preparing you to re-enter the one that you left, because you're not the same person, at all. And some sort of vet friendly reverse boot camp.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, there's also that personal responsibility of realizing this is the case and then taking steps to mitigate it or to move on from it in a way that is positive, not just for you, but for those around you in your circle, mostly your spouse and children, maybe parents, but recognizing that and it's not hard to recognize. So it's one of those, part of that I think can go back to a little bit of entitlement, where you're just kind of standing around waiting for someone to rescue you almost, rather than taking proactive steps after recognizing that this is certainly a thing and you're moving on to another stage of life here. And it's not going to be like it was in Iraq or Afghanistan with your best friends to your right and left in these situations where you weren't worried about a leaky roof or changing a diaper or getting a kid to school on time or any of those other things. You're solely worried about crushing the enemy and making good decisions under fire, because those are going to impact that best friend to your right and your left. So one of the reasons that I prepared so much to go downrange, once again, the power of popular culture. I watched those TV shows in the 80s, those movies in the 80s, those books that I read in the 80s, and a lot of those times that protagonist had an experience in Vietnam that he was rethinking in his head, sitting on a couch now as a private investigator in the 80s or whatever he is in the 80s, police officer now, and thinking if there's something he could have done differently in Vietnam that would have had a different outcome. And he's still struggling with that 10 years later, 15 years later. And as a little kid watching that, I realized I didn't want to leave anything on the field when it came to training. So all the books that I read growing up, everything that I did as far as training physically with firearms, anything I could possibly do so that I knew that even if things went bad, I hadn't left anything on the field. I wouldn't look back and think, I should have read that one other book on tactics or on strategy or on culture in Iraq and Afghanistan, or I should have done one more run through the stress course, or I didn't want to have those thoughts. And so I proactively did everything I possibly could to keep that pendulum on the side of the team, because that's what I owe those people I'm taking downrange. That's what I owe their families. I have to be at the very top of my game, and I never want to be sitting on that couch 10 years later wondering if there was a different decision or something I could have done differently in preparation for what was coming in Iraq and Afghanistan.
But isn't the torture of all that knowing that it especially with battle, you get the plan, absolutely, get it buttoned up, but also know that, the best plans in the world go to hell when somebody hits you in the mouth.
Exactly.
And so it's like knowing Like you can prepare. Can you over prepare, in your opinion?
I don't think so, unless you get to a level of maybe anxiety about it or a part where it's not natural. So I guess you could, but I never thought of it in those terms. I always thought of it as getting better every day. I want to be a better operator today and a better leader today than I was yesterday. That's the way I thought of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking of that documentary with what's his name? Alex Honnold, Free Solo.
Oh, gosh, I haven't watched. I need to watch it. Yep.
Oh,
It's been out for a few years now.
put it at the top of your list because as a guy who values what the Army call it, the 5 Ps, prior planning prevents
Piss
poor
poor
performance.
Yeah.
I mean, spoiler alert, this guy climbs El Capitan, or does it have, I think it's El Capitan, um, with no ropes. I mean, it's impossible. It's a 2-day thing that he does in a couple of hours. And every single handhold, every single foothold, every single move, and there are thousands of them, is in his mind.
Wow.
He knows when he has to jump. He knows when he's going to be in midair. He knows which 2 fingers are going to grab the little tiny ledge that's going to keep him from, plunging into oblivion. He knows it all. I've never seen anything that completely and totally prepared, except maybe for a gymnastics routine,
Yeah.
of course, which is highly choreographed, but that's over in 2 minutes. This goes for hours. It's amazing.
Yeah. And if you mess up maybe in gymnastics, you might break something, you might break an ankle, neck, maybe even, but you're not going to plummet thousands of feet into
No, this you just
bunch of
goes
rocks.
flat.
Yeah.
It's amazing, actually. I would like to talk to that guy. I know he's made the rounds, but I honestly, when I watch that doc, I equate it in some weird way to walking on the moon.
Yeah.
Just in terms of a human accomplishment, the the combination of preparation and nerve and strength
Yeah.
that it took to do that. It's just one of those things you go, I see a lot of things and say, I guess maybe with the proper training, I could give that a shot. This, I'm just like, no.
No. I don't need to do that.
Nope.
I'll watch the show. I'll watch the movie though.
Yeah.
So mikeroweWORKS Foundation, we talked a bunch about that. And there was an amazing truck at SEMA show that was unveiled. Incredible. Wow. Did that go up at how do you say Barnett? Is that how you say the auction?
It's Barrett
Barrett
Jackson.
Barrett Jackson.
And this thing's going to be auctioned off on January 25th.
Wow.
And it's a fundraiser for mikeroweWORKS. All the money goes to our scholarship program. But it happened because a guy named Cody Donaldson, who was on the first episode of Survivor, I think, and wound up having a career in TV.
Okay.
He's a fan of the foundation, and he knew these. There's a guy. This is a funny story, man. This is talk about passion. There's a guy named John Richardson who owns a company called Sugar Creek, who makes all the bacon you've ever eaten. They're up in Ohio.
Okay.
And the Sugar Creek plant sells to like Oscar Mayer and Smithfield and so forth. But they're where it starts. But when he's not making bacon, he's completely obsessed with refabricating old cars.
Nice.
And he's done very well. So he's got like this 5,000 square foot garage, bigger than that. It's huge. And what looks like a junkyard of old classics behind it. And he hired a couple dozen great fabricators and techs, and they're constantly refurbishing these old cars. And he just loves the trade and he loves the skill. And this guy, Colby, said to John, why don't you guys put together a truck for Mike's foundation, a one-of-a-kind work truck? And my friends over at Barrett Jackson will auction it off. And this is a big deal, Jack. But Barrett Jackson, they've raised over $153 million for charity. They do a charity auction each year. But they're also the leading seller of classic refurbished cars.
Incredible.
Car shows all over the country. It's not a world like we were talking about earlier. I'm under the net. I'm around it. I'm interested in it, but I haven't fully geeked out on it.
Yeah.
But I went up to to outside of Columbus to take a look at this garage. These guys put 11,000 man hours into transforming a 1964 Dodge Power Wagon into this one of a kind beast. And just Google Mike Rowe work truck. You'll see the pictures. It's crazy.
It's crazy.
1,100 horsepower engine. I mean, it's just a monster.
Yeah.
And it looks so great. And yeah, every 6 months or so, I try and do something to call attention to the foundation. And I think this will get some press.
Oh yeah. This is a big one. It's beautiful. On my list is a Power Wagon at some point. Those ones that look like this one. So I think it's late, maybe even by 45. I have to go back and look, but they had that look to them, and they looked. Yeah. So I mean, beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, it's truly a work of art. You know, as we were saying before, I don't think AI is ever going to be able to make this truck, but I do think that, you know, taking the art out of the vocational arts was one of the stupidest things we've ever done in the history of education, and getting shop class out of high schools was, you know, a consequence of that. This garage, these guys, these are artists, and watching them put this truck together was really humbling.
Wow. And I know you're going to be humble about this too, and it's true that, I mean, you have changed the world through your inspiration, through your story, and you're changing it through the mikeroweWORKS Foundation. There's no doubt about that. You're having such a huge impact on this country. My hat is off to you. And there's another thing that raises money for the mikeroweWORKS Foundation, and that is the noble Tennessee whiskey that you have. I'm surprised. I figured there would be a bottle close at hand.
Well, I mean, down here in the office, actually, I went through yours, which is also excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
I should have put a warning on mine because it is quite powerful.
Well,
yeah.
So is this.
Wow, look at that.
This is pretty douchey because I autographed it, but I'm going to get a bottle out to you.
Oh, thank you. That's amazing. That is a beautiful bottle right there. Nice.
Barrel strength. I keep it down here. Break in case of emergencies. We've had a few.
I love it. I love it. Great box too. Great packaging.
Yeah, thanks. Carl Noble, as I mentioned earlier, was my granddad. You know, that phone call from my mom, do something that looked like work, that, you know, he inspired that. So Dirty Jobs happened because of him, and the foundation happened because of him. So whatever we sell online, proceeds come back to mikeroweWORKS. It was supposed to be a short fundraiser we did 3 years ago. A friend of mine who's in the whiskey business had some 5-year-old juice in the barrel, and for whatever reason, the buyer, I think it was during the lockdowns, and next thing I knew, I'm getting a call saying, hey, this is available if you want it. If you've ever thought about doing a bourbon, or in this case, a Tennessee whiskey, you should try it.
Nice.
So I didn't know if I'd love it or not, but I did. And so we got a 6-month supply, put them online, sold out in 3 days.
Wow.
Went back, came up with a new approach, got some more of the juice, and that was 3 years ago. We're in 30 states now.
Nice.
And yeah, it's been a terrific fundraiser. Most of all, it just tastes good. Yeah. And I did it because we rebooted Dirty Jobs during the lockdowns.
Okay.
I thought that would be an important thing to do, and putting my pop's name on it felt right. You know, he only had girls, and it's a weird last name, Noble, Knobel. So the name kind of died with him. So I thought, well, let's put it on some whiskey, tell some stories.
Wow. I love that. Yeah, mine's, over here. This is an empty one.
No, that sends a message.
Yeah. But yeah, this will do some damage. I feel like it should come with a warning on it.
It should. I had 3 buddies over about, I don't know when it was, maybe 6 months ago, and we opened that thing up and finished it. Took a few hours, but yeah, the next morning we were like, yeah, well, that happened.
Oh, yeah, exactly. This one, actually, I just saw this one who signed the back of this one. So, me, Chris Pratt, and Jared Shaw signed the back of this one. So 3 of us finished this one and another one in one evening not too long ago. And I'm surprised any of us ever drank anything after that
I'm
evening.
surprised you can still write.
Yeah, that was a rough one. But great memories. And people can find that in 30 states. Very difficult to get whiskey into these states, I have found, now that I have them.
Bloodbath.
It's incredible. Jeez, I'm surprised anybody does it.
Well, it's the three-tiered system. It's all these artifacts from Prohibition era laws. It's taxes. It's liquor boards. No two are exactly the same. It's crony. I mean, it's just, I wouldn't recommend anybody do it unless they really love it.
Gotta love it.
And I love it. And it's a fun thing to have in the, it's a good arrow in the quiver.
I love that. Exactly. And then tell me about vacuuming in the nude and your mom's latest, Oh No, Not the Home. How many are there out now with your mom?
Here, I'll show you. It's really nice of you to ask because, it's usually conversations about dirty jobs and my granddad and, our work ethic scholarship program and the people I've met and mostly men and work and so forth. But my mother wrote every day for 60 years, every day for as long as I knew her. And then she kind of gave up on her dream of being a best-selling author, but she never gave up on the work. She just kept writing and writing and writing. And then, I got kind of famous and I'm like, Mom, your stories are so good. What happened was one day I read an email that she sent to me about this crazy misadventure where she lost her purse at a local Walmart. And what happens in the course of recovering this thing is like David Sedaris, Pee Your Pants funny. So I just read the email on Facebook and posted it and went off to work. 3 days later, it had 60 million views. So the publisher calls and says, hey, if your mother writes a bunch of stories like that and puts you in them so we have an angle, we'll publish your book. So I said, Mom, write a few more of those stories. Just make sure I'm in them so I can promote them. And she says, well, Michael, I've got 2 other sons. Like,
so
look,
great.
Just do it this once, okay? And then you can write anything you want. So she goes away and she writes this book. It's called About My Mother. I'm not in it at all. It's stories about Carl Noble's wife, Thelma Noble, who nobody has heard of. The stories are amazing, but nobody's going to publish it. So I printed 10,000 copies. They sold out quick. Then Simon and Schuster called. They were like, "Jeez, you didn't tell us she could write." So they published the next one called About Your Father and Other Celebrities I Have Known.
Wow.
Both of them, by the way, bestsellers.
Amazing.
One's number 6, one's number 5. Vacuuming in the Nude, she writes 2 years later.
Yep, I picked that one up. I think that one came out right around the time we first linked up a couple years ago.
Yeah. I mean, dude, so she was 85 when she wrote that.
Love it.
It went to number 4. She's like Irma Bombeck now meets Betty White.
So great.
She's 87. She just wrote this thing.
Yeah.
Oh No, Not the Home. Observations and Confessions of a Grandmother in Transition.
Love it.
Stories of the people she's met in a retirement home. And you'd be like, how can that possibly be funny? Holy crap, dude. People just love it.
Amazing.
So I don't know. I mean, I'm biased. She's my mother. But in terms of second acts, like if you're looking to make the case for persistence or for whatever's possible, especially for writers, I've got to do a better job this year of getting her out there into that world. Because as you know, man, the writing's a tough gig. And she has become a source of encouragement for a lot of writers. Very proud of her. She's amazing.
Oh, that is fantastic. I love how you tell her that you posted something that got 20 million views or something like that, and she comes back with, I think that's my purse story got 60.
Yeah, I was, whenever I'm in Baltimore, I drag him out to look at whatever I'm shooting, and I'm rebooting this show called Returning the Favor. And she was with me, and she's in the back seat of the production van. The cameras are rolling. And she's like, well, how many people are going to watch this? I said, well, our first episode got 40 million downloads. And she said, oh, isn't that wonderful? Yes, I think my first story is at 78 million now.
Something like that. Yeah. That was awesome.
Brutal.
Savage.
But when she's right, she's right.
That's fantastic. I love it. And I know we went way longer than I told you, and I sincerely appreciate it. And you are a storyteller. And when we first talked a couple of years ago, you were telling a story about a retainer that you had found on your run in the Presidio, I believe it was. And this whole thing, and I think you found the owner of said retainer through your platforms and through this story that you told about this retainer.
It's weirder than that, man. It was, again, it was lockdowns, so everything's kind of weird.
Yeah.
And I started rucking. I'm doing
ruck.
8 miles a day, 65 pounds.
Nice.
And it hurts. But in the midst of that, I stopped at a water fountain on this bike path I take, and there's, an oral retainer. It's got all of that weird stuff, the little metal bar and the upper, and it's clearly molded specifically, and somebody took it out of their mouth, put it on the water fountain, got a drink, and then got distracted. So I took a picture of the retainer and wrote a couple of paragraphs from the point of view of a retainer and what it would see from its perch on the water fountain as people come and go. Well, social, it's crazy. A few million people saw it. And I went back the next day and it was still there. So I took another picture of it with me in it and then wrote part 2. And then the next day it was there again. So the third time, now it's like an internet thing, and I can't believe people are taking their pictures next to this retainer, right? So the retainer is just sitting on the water fountain, looking out over the bay, opining on the state of the world and offering unsolicited advice to passersby. And then I went back on the 4th day and it was gone, but there was a letter taped to the top of the fountain addressed to me. And the letter was written as the retainer, talking about the fact that it had a new home now. And I forget where you can find this, but whoever picked it up, it was a pretty good writer. And they started their own Instagram page from the point of view of this retainer that just offers like Ann Landers type advice for the world. So again, if you're looking for things you can't script, anticipate, or otherwise imagine, just live your life with your eyes open. And you just never know, man. There might be a retainer, disgusting, covered with somebody else's spit during the time of a highly contagious plague that has led to a lockdown. But nevertheless, this thing deserves to have a point of view.
Oh my goodness.
And I gave it one. And now it's dispensing its own advice on the interwebs. And that's the world we're living in.
Yeah.
And that's the best answer to your earlier excellent question.
And
this is what our country has come to. We are a saliva-covered retainer. We've lost our owner, and yet we look around and we try to make sense of all that surrounds us.
Wow. Yeah, and the world would be a lesser place without that retainer and telling its stories. So I think that's a great place to leave it. I was going to ask you one last question because your book ends on it, but I'm thinking maybe I'll just let people go and do their own research. And it's about how you were almost hired for The Daily Show twice. And I did Google it. I did try to find that answer, and it didn't pop right up, and I had to run in here. So I didn't see it.
That is so random that you would bring that. Does this go on YouTube? Is this visual?
This is visual.
Give me one second.
Oh, yeah.
I just saw this the other day. I just got a giant pile of crap on the other side of the office.
And I love the painting of the oh, look at that. What? Look at that. What?
This is my first rejection letter.
Oh my goodness.
From The Daily Show, dated August 27th, 1998.
Wow.
Dear Mike, this is your official letter to thank you for coming in to audition for the position as host of The Daily Show and for your patience during the decision-making process. As you know, Jon Stewart has accepted the position. So this is the second rejection letter. I don't know where the first one is. Jon has a long-standing relationship, blah, 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 blah. You did an outstanding job during your test. Again, your delivery of headlines was smooth. Your blah, 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 compliment. Your chat was original and laugh out loud funny, and your interview was, quite frankly, the best we've ever seen. If your real TV work ever ebbs or becomes tiresome, please know that you have an open invitation, blah, 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 blah.
Wow. Wow. That's a pretty good rejection letter, though.
It's a great rejection letter, but it's the second one. I auditioned in 1996 for that show. It was the largest national talent search Comedy Central ever did.
Wow.
And it came down to me and one other guy. And they decided it would be me. And they offered me the job on Friday and told me to come in on Monday to meet the writers. And I came in on Monday and there were no writers to meet. There was just this woman sitting there looking sheepish. And I'm like, everything all right? And she's like, well, the truth is Doug Herzog, the manager at the time or the president of Comedy Central, really wanted Craig Kilborn, and he was tied up with his contract at ESPN. Over the weekend, they agreed to let him out of his contract. So we're going with Craig, but we would like to offer you a role as a correspondent. And I mean, I didn't even know if anybody was going to watch the show. I didn't know what I was doing. I was freelancing back then. But the day before, I had got a call from Dick Clark, who wanted to know if I wanted to host a game show called No Relation. So I'm like, no, I'm going to go host a game show. So I flew out west, and Craig Kilborn took the job. And then a year later, he quits to go do the late night show. I guess it was on CBS. And they call me back. And that's what this was about. This woman says, Mike, the job is yours. We should have hired you in the first place. There's no way you're not going to get it this time. We just need you to come in and like record an episode so we can see it in real time. But the only way this goes off the rails is if this, her words, if this tight ass network comes up with a big pile of money for Norm Macdonald or Dennis Miller or Jon Stewart, but that'll never happen. 2 days later, Jon Stewart got a $4 million deal to host The Daily Show in 1998.
Hey.
And I went on to host game shows and crawl through sewers.
Wow. And that game show, yeah. What happened with
No
that game
Relation.
show? Yeah. You talk a little bit about it in here. Yeah, No Relation.
Oh, yeah. No, it's in there. Yeah. That show would still be on the air. Talk about the diminishment of celebrities. Our celebrity guests were so stupid they couldn't correctly guess the right answer. Basically, like the Johnson family would come out and one of them would be backstage and on stage would be their replacement, somebody impersonating the missing Johnson. And our celebrity panel would have to, determine which one of them was no relation.
Yeah.
And you would think this would be easy, I mean, maybe not easy, but my God, they just couldn't get it right. So we gave away all our grand prizes in the first week. We're going to change the title to Hello Mexico because everybody wound up going to Puerto Vallarta or someplace. It was so, man. I swear to God, this is true. People don't believe me, but the producer worked for Dick Clark, a guy named Tom Frank, still a friend of mine. He was to the point where, like, the Wang family, all five of the Wangs would come out, and Tom was like hiring a black dude to impersonate one of the Wangs. All right, so you get this Chinese family and this black guy, and the celebrities are asking the questions, and the celebrities are thinking, there's no way it's the black guy. It's too obvious. They still couldn't get it. We just kept giving away one grand prize after the next, and then we ran out of money, and that's how that show ended.
Sometimes the obvious choice is the right one. Oh, my goodness.
That's Occam's razor right there, brother.
It is. And before I let you go, did you go on The Daily Show as a guest after
Yeah,
after these
I
rejection
did.
letters? How many times did you go on?
I only went once.
Okay.
It's still out there. It's on the YouTubes, and it never really came up. John Stewart was there, and he at this point, I mean, look, man, here's the truth. This is the place to land the plane. You think you've got your plan. You think you know. Like, I was so sure that The Daily Show was the show that all of that freelancing should have culminated with. And then it didn't happen. And I got a game show. But then it came back. And then it didn't happen again. And so I took this job at Evening Magazine. And then I took that phone call from my mother. And then I wound up in a sewer. And then I wound up becoming a guest. And then Jon Stewart invites me on the show. And I promote Dirty Jobs real good and real hard. The audience explodes. Dirty Jobs goes to the #1 show on the network, launches 35 other shows. And in the midst of that, I launch a foundation called MikeroweWORKS, inspired by the man whose name is on the bottle of whiskey that I sell to raise money for the foundation. Award over $12 million in work ethic scholarships to 2,200 people who are now working as steam fitters and pipe fitters, electricians, HVAC, and so forth. And so I'd love to tell you it was a plan, but one minute I'm just a shy kid with a deep voice and a stutter, and the next minute I'm sitting here talking to you, about to crack into my granddad's whiskey and take our foundation to the next level, even though I can't be vice president with Bobby Kennedy. And hawking my mom's books, for God's sakes. I mean, come on. Is this a great country or what?
It's the best. It is the best. And, to finish up, you're having a multi-generational impact. It's not just those people that are getting these scholarships. It's them, their families, everybody in their orbit that you're influencing as well. And you'll never know how many people that you've influenced for the better, how many lives, how many families you've had a positive impact on. So thank you for that. Thank you for your inspiration. Thank you for the whiskey when it arrives. And looking forward to linking up in person so we can share a drink one of these days in your current stopping grounds.
Thanks to you also, Jack Carr. You're doing the same thing. Those little time machines you keep cranking out will take lives of their own. They'll assume their own trajectory, their own inertia, and long after you're gone, those tomahawks in the background will endure. And those books will mean something, and those shows will mean something, and you will influence in ways that you'll probably never see. But in the end, say whatever you want about it. It's a privilege. And we are a couple of lucky dudes to be rounding out a very interesting year and entering the next one to be able to do what we do.
This is true. And thank you
in
so
spite
much
of this
for everything.
freaking rejection.
Maybe because of it,
Maybe.
Yeah, building on that foundation. That's part of the foundation that you built upon. So, oh man, well, hey, thank you so much. This has been amazing, and love hanging out with you. Any opportunity I get to talk with you is so much fun and such an honor. So, thank you.
Next time in person.
Let's do it. You take care.
Adios.
If you enjoyed this episode, click here, watch another episode, or click here to watch a clip of the podcast.